I didn't realize how quiet a forest could become until the silence itself started to feel like a presence, like something leaning over my shoulder and waiting to see what I'd do next. I'd driven my old Volkswagen Westphalia deep into the high timberlands of northern Colorado, a place I'd always considered one of the last stretches of America where a person could get lost on purpose. My friends used to joke that the woods up there were big enough to swallow a person whole. I used to laugh at that. I don't laugh anymore. I was 33 then, old enough to have outgrown stunts, but young enough to still chase solitude, like something I needed to prove. I'd camped alone plenty of times before. Utah's deserts, Montana's back roads, the Badlands in late autumn. But this trip wasn't about adventure. It was about escape. I'd been wrestling with something I didn't want to name, a kind of worn-down exhaustion that made everyday life feel brittle, hollow. The forest had always helped me find my footing. So I packed the van, grabbed some old topo maps, and aimed for a valley I'd only heard locals whisper about, Cinderbrush Hollow. Most Coloradans don't know it by name. The land isn't marked on many modern maps. But if you spend enough nights around small-town bars, talking to old-timers who still remember when families traveled everywhere by RV instead of planes, you'll hear stories, half warnings, half nostalgia, about the way that place used to be. They said the woods there were dense enough to turn someone around in circles, even on a clear day. They said the storms moved faster there too, rolling over the ridge like they were chasing something. But the real stories, the ones people only told after a few drinks, were about what those storms used to uncover. Relics, they called them. Lost RVs from the 60s and 70s, abandoned trailers, motorhomes that vanished decades ago. Time capsules preserved in pine needles and dust. Some said people walked away from them during storms and never came back. Others said the forest moved around them, reclaiming them, swallowing them like it swallowed everything else. I didn't believe any of it. Not then. The first day was calm. I found a clearing off an old logging road, a perfect spot where the pines opened into a soft bowl of grass, almost intentional, as if it had been shaped by human hands long before I arrived. I parked the Volkswagen with the front nose pointed toward the valley, set out my folding table, boiled some coffee. The air smelled like cold sap and granite dust, and the sunset filtered through the trees in fat amber streaks. For a moment, it felt good to be alone. Quiet unease hadn't touched me yet, but unease always starts subtly, like the environment testing you. It happened while I was unpacking the last crate from the van. I heard something, a dull metallic creak, like an old door shifting on its hinges. The kind of sound a rusted trailer might make when wind pushes it open. I froze, peering through the trees. Nothing moved. No wind. No branches bending. Just stillness. I shook it off. Forests make weird sounds. They echo. By nightfall, the temperature dropped 15 degrees. My breath floated pale and thin as I sat inside the van, the small battery lantern casting a warm cone of light over my journal. I've always kept one on trips, more out of habit than sentiment. Writing helps me settle, helps me notice things I'd ignore otherwise. That night, though, the words didn't flow. My mind kept drifting back to the metallic creak. It felt out of place, too crisp, too intentional. Around 10 p.m., I stepped outside to brush my teeth and nearly choked on the cold. The kind of cold that felt like it came from underground instead of the air. I zipped my jacket and looked around. I don't know why. Nothing was supposed to be there. But the clearing felt wrong, as if it had shifted somehow. Like the edges were tighter. The trees moved a little closer than before. Then came the second sound. A soft rhythmic tapping. 2 taps. Then a pause. 3 taps, a longer pause, then 1 tap sharp like a knuckle against metal. It wasn't wind, and it wasn't animal. I turned slowly toward the source. At first I didn't see anything, just shadows layered over shadows, but then maybe 30 yards out, something caught the corner of the lantern glow. A glint. Pale and thin, something metallic. I stepped back inside the van, shut the door, and locked it. That was the first time the tension really settled in my chest. Not panic, not dread, Just tension, the kind that makes your body want to stay alert long after the mind says relax. I crawled into the top bunk, listening for the tapping again, listening for footsteps, for breathing, for anything. But the forest went silent. Too silent. Like it was holding its breath. It took hours before sleep finally got the better of me. The next morning, I forced myself to pretend everything was normal. I brewed coffee, fried eggs, marked a few trail points on my map, but I couldn't shake the memory of that glint in the dark. So before starting the hike I'd planned, I walked toward where I'd seen it. The ground dipped slightly, forming a shallow hallway between the pines. And there it was. A fragment of aluminum siding, curled like a torn page, old, bent in the center, half buried in needles. The edges were oxidized to a chalky white. I crouched, brushing it with my fingers. It felt cold, colder than the forest floor around it, almost refrigerator cold, and the shape wasn't natural. It was cut clean, manufactured. As I traced the metal, I noticed something else behind it. Not another piece of siding, something bigger. A roof. A full, intact RV roof jutting out of the hillside like a fossil. The rest of it was still buried, preserved perfectly under layers of soil and moss, like the earth had swallowed it slowly and decided to leave just enough visible to remind anyone passing by that people once moved through this place, lived here, traveled here, disappeared here. I stepped closer. The roof vent was rusted shut, and the paint had peeled into thin curls. There was a crack running through the length of the window frame, and the glass behind it was dark, so dark it looked like water. And that's when I noticed the smell. Not rot. Not animal. Oldness. Stale fabric. Dust trapped for decades. The way a sealed attic smells when first opened. The smell of time that's been waiting too long. Something in me whispered, turn back. And I should have listened. I knew I should have. But curiosity always wins with me. Curiosity is why people like me travel alone in Volkswagens rather than staying home. Curiosity is also what gets people in trouble. I kneeled, brushed aside more needles, and uncovered the top edge of a door. A faded sticker clung to the paint, the letters warped but still legible enough to read. Cinderbrush Campground, Lot 14, registered guest. It hit me in the gut. Lot 14. I had parked almost exactly where the old logging road veered off. Roughly where that lot would have been back in the 70s before the campground was shut down. I wasn't just near someone's abandoned RV. I was camping on top of it. My chest tightened. The tension turned into something sharper, suspicion, as in, this isn't natural. This wasn't just a relic erosion uncovered. This felt placed, hidden, buried intentionally. But by what or who? My hands were still on the metal when I heard it. A knock from inside the buried RV. Not loud. Not frantic, just one slow, deliberate knock, right beneath where my palm rested. I stumbled backwards so fast I fell into the pine needles. My breath caught. The forest tilted around me, or maybe that was just my adrenaline spiking. I stared at the hillside, waiting for movement, for a second knock, for anything. Nothing. Just that old smell seeping out like a sigh. I backed away step by step, eyes locked on the buried roof until I reached the clearing again. I didn't realize I was shaking until I dropped my coffee mug and heard it crack against a rock. For the rest of the morning, I tried to pretend I imagined it. I convinced myself the knock was maybe falling dirt or a root shifting or the echo of my own movement. But no matter how I spun it, nothing about it felt accidental. It felt intentional. Like something inside that RV had recognized the touch of my hand after decades and decided to answer back. And yet, part of me still didn't want to leave. Not because I wasn't scared, I was, but because something unspoken tugged at me. A memory I didn't want to acknowledge yet. A reason I'd chosen this valley, this forgotten campground, this place where people once built temporary homes on wheels before vanishing. So I stayed. I shouldn't have, but I did. And by the time the sun dipped low again, the forest had already begun shifting towards something darker, something that wasn't ready to stay buried any longer. By the time dusk settled over the clearing, the forest felt different, denser, heavier, like the air itself had developed weight. Every sound seemed sharper than it should have been. Pine needles crunching under small feet, the distant groan of trees bending in the cooling air, the faint whistle of wind threading through branches. The woods weren't just surrounding me anymore. They were watching, listening, waiting. I tried to busy myself with small tasks, anything to push back the lingering image of that half-buried RV roof jutting from the hillside like a fossilized rib. I cooked dinner, adjusted the leveling chocks on the Volkswagen, sorted through my gear. But my eyes kept flicking toward the trees, toward that hidden slope where Lot 14 had once stood. I couldn't stop thinking about the knock. I kept replaying it in my mind, that slow and deliberate tap, a single, unmistakably conscious sound. At some point, I caught myself staring at my reflection in the van window, eyes tight, jaw clenched, trying to look braver than I felt. That was the moment I realized I wasn't dealing with fear anymore. Suspicion had rooted itself deep, threading through every thought. Something in those woods knew I was there. Something buried, something waiting. As darkness took over completely, the cold thickened fast. My breath fogged the air inside the van, and frost hazed over the edges of the windshield. I kept the lantern on low, letting its warm glow fill the small space while I scribbled in my journal, trying to anchor myself, but the words were unfocused. My handwriting drifted between tight and jagged, like my mind couldn't decide whether to flee or freeze. Around 9:30, the tapping returned. Soft at first. 2 taps. A pause. 3 taps. The same pattern as the night before. But this time, it wasn't distant. It wasn't from the slope. It came from behind the van. My breath stopped. I didn't move, didn't blink, just listened. Tap. Tap. Then silence. A long silence, long enough that a normal person would have relaxed. But the fear digging into my spine wasn't normal. It was the kind that makes the body anticipate things before the mind can form them. Then came the next sound, something brushing against the sheet metal of the van. Not claws, not branches, fabric. Like someone in heavy clothing had run a sleeve along the side of the Volkswagen. Slowly, deliberately. I grabbed the lantern and froze, listening to the soft rasp move from the back panel to the sliding door. Then it stopped. The silence that followed felt intrusive, like something was leaning close, waiting to hear if I'd breathe. A wave of dread rolled up my throat. Not panic yet. Panic comes later. This was dread, the sort that pulls your thoughts into places you don't want them to go. I imagined someone standing outside, their face inches from the thin sheet of metal separating us. Someone who'd been living in those woods long enough to move without making sound. I waited. The forest waited with me. When the scraping started again, it came from near the passenger door. Lower this time, like fingers dragging through frost. I bolted upright, lantern trembling in my hand. I knew I needed to look. Every instinct screamed not to, but the stronger voice whispered that if I didn't, I'd only imagine something worse. I slid out of the sleeping bag, positioned myself carefully, and edged toward the windshield. Keeping the lantern low, I lifted my gaze slowly toward the glass. At first, I saw nothing but darkness and the pale outline of trees. Then something moved. A shadow, small, too small to be a person, but larger than any animal that would approach a vehicle. It darted beneath the front bumper and disappeared into the brush with a faint rustle. My pulse thudded painfully. I waited for it to return, waited for any sign of footsteps or movement. But the woods went silent again. That awful, unnatural silence that had followed the knock earlier. The silence that felt staged. I didn't sleep that night. Not more than a minute at a time. Every few breaths, I heard something shift in the brush or snap under the weight of something moving slowly. Always slow. Always deliberate. As though the forest didn't want me to know how close it actually was. Sometime around 3 a.m., exhaustion must have taken over because I jolted awake to the sound of footsteps, light footsteps, circling the van. Gravel crunching, needles shifting, someone pacing. I lay frozen on my back, staring at the van ceiling, the lantern casting faint shadows that trembled each time I exhaled. Whoever it was, they were slow, careful, like they were mapping the van's shape. I thought about yelling, thought about turning on my headlamp and shining it outside, But something inside me, a deep and primal instinct, held me still, told me that making noise was the worst thing I could do. The footsteps finally stopped. I listened hard. The silence stretched thin. Then, just when I thought it was over, I heard one final thing, a soft knock on the sliding door. The same rhythm. 2 taps, pause, 3 taps, longer pause, 1 tap. My skin prickled so violently it felt like electricity. Whoever or whatever was out there had followed me from the buried RV, had learned the rhythm, had repeated it, and now it was standing close enough to touch the van. A wave of panic shot through me, raw and uncontrollable. I held my breath until my lungs begged for air, terrified that even the slightest sound would provoke something. Eventually, the cold quiet thickened again, and the forest settled into a stillness so deep that it told me the footsteps had stopped. I didn't know if whatever was outside had left or was simply waiting, listening. By sunrise, I still hadn't moved. My muscles cramped from lying stiff for so long, and my mouth was dry from holding breath in fear. When light finally seeped through the windows, I forced myself to get up and look outside. Nothing was disturbed. Not at first glance. The van looked the same, the trees looked the same, but the ground didn't. Around the Volkswagen were prints, shallow, irregular, dragging slightly between steps. Not boot prints, not bare feet, something in between. Human, but wrong. The stride was uneven, and the depth varied like the person was shifting weights strangely, or limping, or learning how to walk again. I followed the prints toward the tree line. They led straight to the hillside above Lot 14. Back to the buried RV. A heavy pressure cinched around my ribs. Reflection hit me hard and unwelcome, the way it always does when fear forces meaning into something you don't want to see. I'd come here because I was losing my grip on my work, my relationships, my sense of who I was. I'd told myself this trip was about clarity, about reconnecting with quiet. But standing there, staring at those deformed tracks, I realized something deeper was pushing me toward this valley. Something older, something tied to memory. I had been here before, not here exactly, not this spot, but near. Somewhere within this stretch of forgotten forest. A long time ago. I was young, maybe 8 or 9. My parents had brought me on a camping trip in an RV park they loved, a place that shut down not long after our visit because of a storm that washed out the lower lots. I remembered the wooden signs, the dusty gravel roads, the silhouettes of strange old campers half hidden beneath tarps. I remembered lot numbers. Lot 14. A chill slid down my spine. I crouched near the prints, my breath fogging. They were fresh, hours old at most. And the way they angled toward the hillside, it wasn't a path someone took. It was a path someone emerged from. My body understood the truth before my mind did. The prints weren't leading to the buried RV. They were leading away from it. I stepped back instinctively. My heartbeat hammered. Something had climbed out during the night. Something that hadn't walked on the forest floor in decades. Something that had knocked from inside. I felt the dread twist into the first edge of panic. I needed to leave. I rushed back to the Volkswagen, threw open the door, and tossed gear inside with shaking hands. My breath came fast, too fast. The cold stung my lungs. I fumbled the keys, almost dropped them and forced them into the ignition. But when I turned the key, the engine didn't start. It didn't even click. The van was dead. Not battery dead. Something else. Something wrong. And when I looked up through the windshield, heart pounding so violently it made my vision tremble, I saw movement on the slope. A figure standing halfway up the hill. Still. Watching. Waiting. And as the rising sun lit its outline, I realized with absolute certainty it wasn't someone from today, it was someone from the campground that used to be here. Someone who never left. The figure on the slope didn't move at first. It stood there like a misplaced memory, an outline cut from an older decade and pasted into the present. My breath snagged as I stared at it through the frosted windshield. The rising sun washed the figure in a pale gold glow, revealing just enough to confirm my worst thought. The shape wasn't modern. Its clothes were faded, the fabric hanging stiff, frozen in time, like something preserved beneath the forest floor. A jacket that might have been blue once, pants that looked too loose around the joints, and a posture that reminded me of someone learning how to stand again after years of stillness. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, it lifted its head. Not all the way, just enough for me to see the hollow indentation where the eyes should have caught light. There was darkness there, not shadow, darkness, like the sockets had been emptied long before I ever stepped foot into the clearing. My hand trembled on the key. I tried the ignition again. Nothing. No sputter, no spark, no attempt to turn over. The Volkswagen was lifeless. My only escape had become a coffin on wheels. The figure shifted. Its head tilted slightly, almost curious, as if trying to understand why I was struggling. Then, one step at a time, it began to descend the slope. Its gait was uneven, not broken, just unused, like someone wearing their legs for the first time after a lifetime underground. Each footfall made a soft, sickening crunch. Pine needles, frost, soil being crushed under weight that didn't look heavy enough to make that sound. I scanned the van for anything useful. My flashlight, a hatchet, my phone. But when I grabbed my phone from the dashboard and pressed the power button, the screen stayed black, dead. Like the forest had drained every device around me. The figure took another step, then another. I could see more details now. The lines of the jacket, the faded stripes on the sleeves, and the badge pinned crookedly to the chest. I stared, heart pounding until the letters finally made sense. Cinderbrush Staff Maintenance Crew. My stomach twisted so hard I felt nauseous. A staff member, from the campground that shut down decades ago. Someone who'd once walked those old gravel loops, repaired busted water spigots, and checked on guests. Someone who'd worn that uniform before the storm erased the place from every brochure. Someone who'd been buried with the RVs. It moved closer, its footsteps soft but certain, its head twitching slightly with each step, like it was navigating by sound rather than sight. I ducked down instinctively, pressing myself against the floor between the seats, my breath breaking into thin, shaky gasps. The footsteps stopped, directly outside the driver's door. Then came the knock. Not the tap-tap pattern from before. Not a coded rhythm. 3 slow knocks. Heavy, measured, like someone asking to be let in. I clamped my hand over my mouth, every muscle trembling, my pulse thudded in my ears, drowning out the wind. For a moment, I thought I might faint. The knocks came again, 3 more, each one dragging through my spine like a blade. The figure stayed there, patiently, waiting. When it finally moved, the shift was so sudden I almost screamed. The footsteps scraped along the side of the van, toward the sliding door. Slow, testing, feeling the edges of the metal like it was remembering the shape of something or someone. When it reached the middle of the door, it stopped again. Then a new sound, light at first, like fingertips brushing the panel, then harder, nails, long nails, scratching down the length of the door with unsettling precision. Not random, searching for the latch. My chest tightened so painfully I thought a rib might crack. I pressed my back to the passenger seat base, knees drawn tight, holding my breath until my lungs ached. I knew I couldn't let it get in. Whatever had climbed out of that buried RV wasn't a lost hiker, wasn't a ghost, wasn't anything I could understand, but it was looking for something. Maybe recognition, maybe company, maybe replacement. The scratching grew sharper, more insistent. The metal began to creak as pressure increased on the sliding handle. I squeezed my eyes shut, feeling the tremble of the door under the figure's weight. Then, something interrupted. A deep groan echoed through the forest, followed by a sharp crack. Not close. From the hillside. The buried RV. The figure froze, turned. The scratches stopped instantly, as if someone had snapped their fingers. Another groan. Louder. A cracking like metal bending under strain. My mind flashed to the image of the buried RV roof, the cracked window, the stale smell of time leaking out. Something else was happening up there. The figure took one step backward, then another, reluctant, torn. And then it gave a sound, a quiet, broken exhale, almost like a sigh, before turning fully toward the hill and moving away from the van. Not walking this time. Hurrying. I crawled up enough to peer through the lower edge of the window. The figure was halfway up the slope, its movements jerky and frantic now. Something was drawing it back, calling it, or demanding it. The ground above the RV bulged, pine needles rolled down the hillside like loose sand. A deep hollowness cracked beneath the surface, and a cold wind surged outward so sharp it stung my skin through the glass. Then the earth split, not widely, just enough. A seam of darkness opened across the roof of the buried RV, releasing a burst of stale air so cold it fogged the surrounding branches. The figure reached the opening and dropped to its knees, hands digging into the soil as if trying to push its way back inside. I watched it claw at the ground, watched its head bow low, watched it shaking violently, like whatever lived in that RV wasn't letting it in, or wasn't letting it go. The hillside shuddered, roots snapped, dirt slid. The crack widened for a moment, swallowing the figure's hands up to the wrists. Then the earth slammed shut. Fast, violent, final. The figure's body jerked once, arms trapped beneath the soil, before collapsing forward, face pressed against the cold ground. The forest exhaled a long, trembling breath of wind that rippled through every pine, a sound like grief, or anger, or release. When the figure finally stopped moving, its arms still buried, its back rising and falling with one last impossible breath, I knew the forest wasn't done with it. I knew it belonged to this place, and this place had reclaimed it. But something else lingered. Something waiting. Something aware of me. I didn't wait to find out what. I scrambled into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel with frozen fingers. I tried the ignition again, even though I knew, deep down, it wouldn't respond. But this time, the engine coughed. Once. Twice. Then roared to life so loudly it echoed across the hollow like a warning shot. I slammed the van into gear, tires shredding frost as I sped down the logging road, branches whipping against the windows. The forest blurred into streaks of dark green and gray. I didn't look back, not once. Not even when the cold wind surged behind me, or when the woods seemed to lean closer as I passed. I drove until the road turned to gravel, then to asphalt, then finally to the small town miles below the ridge. Only when the sun was fully up and the Volkswagen had warmed enough for my hands to stop shaking did I dare pull over. I sat there, staring at the wheel, breathing in slow, desperate gulps. But even there, under open sky and bright daylight, the smell clung to me. That same old, trapped smell. The smell of time that had waited too long. I don't camp near forgotten campgrounds anymore. I don't chase solitude for clarity. I don't go looking for time capsules the forest tries to bury, because some things stay hidden for a reason, and some relics aren't found. They wake up, they wait, they knock, and if you're unlucky enough to answer, they follow. I didn't plan on driving into the Appalachians that late in the season, but something in me felt pulled there, like the mountains were whispering a reminder that some roads don't wait for the perfect moment. I'd been living out of my old Volkswagen Westphalia for months at that point, chasing quiet campgrounds, empty overlooks, and the kind of stillness you can only feel when there's nothing between you and the cold forest air but a thin sheet of metal. The Appalachians were supposed to be a brief stop, a slowdown, but from the moment I crossed the state line, a quiet unease pressed into me like someone had rested a hand on my shoulder without asking. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was instinct. I was 34 then, still trying to prove to myself that traveling alone made me strong rather than lonely. I'd been telling people I was out here to reconnect with nature, clear my head, find clarity. But the truth was much simpler and far more embarrassing. I just didn't know where else to be. The Volkswagen gave me motion, and motion felt better than standing still. My first night on the edge of the Appalachian Trail should have felt peaceful. The campground was nearly empty, tucked behind a thick curtain of hemlock and maple, the kind of place where people wrote reviews calling it serene, rustic, untouched. I picked a site near the tree line, parked the van just off the gravel pad, and sat on the bumper listening to the forest breathe. The air was cold enough that every exhale felt like smoke leaving my lungs. I remember thinking the silence was too clean, too perfect, like sound had been scraped out of the woods entirely. I didn't see anyone else until a man in a faded flannel wandered out of the trees, holding a bundle of firewood. He looked mid-40s, weather-beaten but kind, the sort of local who knew every ridge by name. He nodded in my direction, the stiffness of someone who expected strangers to keep to themselves. Even from a distance, I could tell his clothes were damp, not from rain, from sweat. He sized up my van, then spoke without getting too close. "You hiking those trails out here?" His tone wasn't casual. It was closer to concern. I told him I might take a short section the next day, nothing too deep. He shifted his weight and rubbed the back of his neck like he was weighing whether to keep talking. "It's been a weird year on the ridges," he said. "Fog hangs too long. People get turned around. Happens every season, sure, but this time it's different." He stopped, glanced toward the tree line, then added with a forced laugh that didn't reach his eyes, "Stick close to camp if you're out early, and don't wander off if the path splits. They've had folks vanish." The word didn't land lightly. Before I could ask anything else, he raised a hand, walked off, and didn't look back. I figured it was backwoods superstition or a dramatic way of telling outsiders to respect the land. Every region has stories like that, warnings disguised as folklore. But something about the way he said vanish stuck with me long after the forest swallowed him. The temperature dropped fast after sundown. I wrapped myself in a blanket inside the Volkswagen and cracked one of the windows for air. The faint smell of pine drifted in, but underneath it I caught something else. Damp soil, metallic and sour, almost like the ground had been turned over recently. I tried to shake it off. New places always smell strange the first night. The woods were still, too still. No insects, no wind, no night birds, just an occasional dry snap of a branch far, far beyond where my headlights reached. That's when I first heard it, a single knock, not on my van, not on a tree, more like something tapping the earth itself. A hollow, rhythmic thud, exactly 3 times, spaced evenly apart. I sat up, heart stuttering. The sound didn't come again. I closed the window, slid deeper into my blanket, and whispered to myself that forests play tricks on tired minds. Around midnight, I woke to the realization that I wasn't alone. Not inside the van, outside it. Something stood just behind the rear panel. I couldn't see it, but I felt the presence the way you feel someone staring at you from across a dim room. My breath slowed to a thin, painful thread as I tried to listen past the pounding in my ears. Crunch, a footstep, human, soft, careful. My hand drifted toward the flashlight near my pillow, but I didn't turn it on. Instead, I held my breath until my chest burned, waiting for another sound. Nothing. The presence lingered, though. I could feel it, a weight on the night. I forced myself to stay still, eyes wide in the darkness, tracking every rustle against the van's thin metal shell. Finally, after what felt like half an hour, the feeling lifted, like the night had exhaled. I didn't hear footsteps leaving, just the sense of absence. I didn't sleep. Not really. I locked every door, shoved gear against the sliding panel, and sat upright until pale light broke across the ridgeline. By morning, I was almost able to convince myself I'd imagined everything. Almost. I stepped outside, stretching my stiff back, and immediately noticed something off. Behind my van, the soil was disturbed. Not footprints exactly, but indentations in the moss where someone had stood. They weren't sharp, not clear enough to identify, but the spacing matched human legs. And the earth was pressed deeper than an average step, like whoever stood there had been shifting their weight for a long time. Watching me, the man in flannel walked past my sight again, slower this time. When he saw where I was looking, his expression changed. "Something bothered you last night?" I hesitated. Admitting fear felt like admitting weakness. "I thought I heard someone," I said. "Behind the van." His jaw tightened. Not the first time someone said that. I asked him what he meant, but he only shook his head. "People think these mountains are quiet," he said. "They're wrong. The quiet is just how they talk." Then he added, "Keep your lights off tonight. Whatever you heard, lights make it curious." The warning wasn't theatrical. It was tired, almost apologetic, like he hated the fact that he even had to say it. By afternoon, I convinced myself I was being paranoid. I'd come here to slow down, to breathe, to let the Volkswagen settle into the shade of old trees while I found my balance again. I wasn't going to let the strange stillness, or the man's warnings, or the midnight presence chase me back onto the highway. So I decided to hike a short section of the trail. Just a few miles, nothing challenging, enough to clear my head and remind myself why I was here. I packed light: water, small first aid kit, backup battery, map, and a thin windbreaker. Before locking up the van, I ran my hand along its frame, grounding myself with the familiar feel of chipped paint and cool metal. The trailhead started behind the campground, marked by a wooden sign so weathered the letters looked carved by ghosts. The first mile was peaceful. Leaves crackled under my boots, sunlight filtered through the canopy in warm, broken shards, and the forest felt more normal than it had the night before. But around the second mile, the air changed. It cooled sharply, like I'd stepped into the shadow of a structure that wasn't there. The wind dropped off completely. Even my own footsteps began to sound distorted, too soft, like the forest floor was muffled. Then I noticed something else. No birds. Again, I stopped walking, listening for anything: wind, distant chatter, the creak of branches. Instead, the silence pressed around me like a hand closing over my ears. The unease from the night before returned, stronger. My instincts whispered to turn around. Go back. Something's wrong here. But a harder part of me, the part that had driven across states chasing clarity, insisted I wasn't going to run from shadows or silence. I kept walking. 3 more minutes up the trail, my boot caught something half buried beneath a layer of pine needles. I crouched, brushing the debris aside. A hiking pole, snapped in half. The metal was bent, not broken cleanly, as if something had twisted it. A cold wave rolled through me. I looked up and saw the faint outlines of another trail branching off to the right, unmarked, swallowed by thicker brush, almost invisible to anyone not standing exactly where I was. A trail that shouldn't exist. And for the first time since arriving, I felt genuine dread climb my spine. Because I knew, without understanding how, that the vanished people didn't get lost. They were following that path, and something was waiting for them. I stepped toward it. My mistake was taking that first step. The soil shifted under my weight as I crossed the threshold where the hidden path branched off, and it felt different immediately. Looser, almost too soft, as if the ground remembered the weight of others who'd stepped there before me. The brush closed in close enough to tug at my jacket, and the silence deepened until my breath became the loudest sound in the valley. I moved slow, scanning for any sign of tracks, any hint of what had bent that hiking pole, but the forest offered nothing except the quiet ache of something unseen. A few yards in, the canopy swallowed the light, and I had to blink to adjust. My pulse thudded in my ears. I kept expecting to smell rot or animal musk or something that would tell me what direction danger lived in. Instead, the air was empty, hollow, as if the trail itself had been carved out of absence. Maybe 40 feet into this narrow corridor of brush, I saw it. A scrap of fabric caught on a branch at shoulder height, swaying slightly even though the air was perfectly still. It was faded red, the fraying edges stiff with dirt. I reached out and touched it with 2 fingers. Cold, stiff, the kind of cold that didn't match the air, the kind that lingered no matter the weather. I should have turned around then, but fear has a way of pulling you forward when it can't push you back. I kept walking. The deeper I went, the less the path looked like a trail and more like something people forced their way through. Branches were snapped waist-high, shrubs were crushed into the soil, and every few steps, I saw something half-buried: broken sunglasses, a torn strap from a backpack, a crushed plastic bottle. None of it looked deliberately left behind. It looked dropped, lost, abandoned mid-movement. Then the smell hit me. It rolled in slow at first, barely detectable, like the scent of wet stone after a storm. But it grew stronger with every breath until it coated the back of my throat. Metallic, damp, somewhere between rust and old blood. I pulled my shirt up over my nose, but But it didn't help. The smell wasn't coming from any one direction. It felt like it was rising from the soil itself. The brush thinned suddenly, opening into a clearing no larger than a living room. The air here was colder, unnaturally cold. My skin prickled with goosebumps, even though I hadn't broken a sweat. At the center of the clearing was a dead tree, or what used to be a tree. It had been broken off at the trunk, and the top half lay several feet away, as if something had snapped it down in one brutal motion. The splintered wood was charred on one side, the blackened bark curling like burnt paper. But it wasn't the tree that made my heart stutter. It was what was leaning against it. A single hiking boot, perfectly upright, facing the trail I had come from. And inside it, darkened fabric, damp and collapsed, was the unmistakable shape of a sock still holding form. I froze. It wasn't old. It hadn't been there long. There was dew on the leather, but no rot, no mold. Whoever left it behind hadn't walked away from this clearing on two legs. The quiet unease inside me solidified into dread. I turned slowly in a full circle, scanning the perimeter. No sign of an animal attack, no claw marks, no blood spatter, no drag, just the boot, and the silence pressing in like a held breath. A whisper of wind brushed the back of my neck, cold as the underside of a stone. Except the air wasn't moving. That was enough. I backed toward where the trail had been, desperate for the comfort of normal forest sound. But the moment I stepped out of the clearing, the woods shifted. The trail was gone, not faded, not obscured. Gone. Every direction looked identical, walls of brush, tangled roots, and towering trunks that felt too close together. My heartbeat rose into a painfulness in my chest. I spun left, then right, trying to pick out any sign of the narrow path I'd pushed through only minutes before. Nothing matched, nothing opened, nothing pointed home. The silence thickened, and this time it wasn't empty. It felt crowded, full of something listening. I swallowed hard and forced myself not to panic. Panic kills quicker than whatever else lives out here. I steadied my breath, crouched down, and looked for bent grass, broken stems, disturbed soil, anything. A faint imprint of my boot showed in the dirt, angled toward a cluster of brush. I pushed through it fast, branches scraping my arms, leaves brushing my face. 5 feet. 10 feet. The forest hit me with a wall of cold air so sharp it felt like stepping into a freezer. I stumbled out the other side and froze. I was back in the clearing. The dead tree in front of me, the boot still leaning, except now it was turned slightly, angled toward me, like it had shifted. My breath caught. My legs went rigid. I stared at the boot, waiting, watching for even the tiniest movement. It didn't move again, but the world around me felt wrong. Tilted, like the clearing had closed behind me, sealing me in the moment I re-entered it. I whispered to myself to stay calm, but the whisper sounded foreign, like someone else had spoken from just over my shoulder. A twig snapped behind me. I spun, heart crashing into my ribs. Nothing. No animal, no person, no movement. Just another patch of brush in the oppressive cold. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone. No signal. Of course, I checked the time, but the screen flickered, glitched, and dimmed. The battery icon emptied itself in seconds until the phone went black. The cold air felt thicker now, heavy, like it wasn't a temperature but a presence. I forced myself to step backward slowly, keeping my eyes on the tree and the boot. The smell grew stronger, metallic, sour, and underneath it, something else. A faint, rhythmic vibration in the ground, almost like a heartbeat deep beneath the soil. I moved faster. At the edge of the clearing, I stopped and tried again to find any sign of my trail. I closed my eyes, inhaled slowly, and pictured the route I'd taken. The angle of sunlight, the slope of the hill, the bend in the brush. I turned right, then pushed through a narrow opening between two trees. This time, the world didn't freeze me with cold. The air felt normal. Warmer. I pushed farther, breath held tight in my chest, and then I saw it. A blue breadcrumb flag tied around a branch. Something I hadn't noticed before. Something that definitely wasn't mine, but it wasn't old either. The fabric was bright, clean, almost new. Someone had come through here, recently, and left a marker. I wasn't alone. A mix of relief and fear rushed me. I followed it, weaving through trees, scanning for movement. 20 yards ahead, another blue flag hung, then another. Then a shape, a person, standing between two pines. My breath caught. He was facing away from me, backpack slung over one shoulder, clothes dirty but intact. Relief hit so hard I nearly shouted. I stepped forward, raising a hand. Hey, thank God, I thought I was. He turned, too slowly. His head rotating before his shoulders followed. His face was pale, not sickly pale, empty pale. Eyes unfocused, like he wasn't fully inside himself. Dirt streaked his cheeks in unnatural patterns, like he'd been dragged through the soil face first. And in his right hand, he held a hiking boot, the same one from the clearing. He raised it slowly, as if offering it to me. But there was nothing human in the gesture. There was nothing human in him at all. My legs reacted before my mind did. I stumbled backward, almost falling, breath tearing through my throat. The man didn't chase. He didn't blink. He just watched me with those hollow eyes, holding the boot like a question I couldn't answer. And then, without a sound, he turned and walked straight into the brush. Not around it. Through it. Branches parted around him as if the forest accepted his presence. I didn't wait to see where he went. I ran. Branches clawed at my clothes, roots grabbed at my boots. My breath came ragged and I kept glancing back, expecting to see him following. I didn't, but the forest around me pulsed, soft vibrations under my feet, rhythmic tremors like something massive breathing beneath the soil. The Volkswagen felt 1,000 miles away. I didn't know if I'd ever see it again, but I ran toward where I prayed the trail had been, and somewhere behind me, deep in the trees, I heard that same hollow thud. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, answering my footsteps, and getting closer. I didn't realize I was screaming until my throat burned. The forest blurred around me in streaks of brown and green, and every step felt like slamming into the ground with the full weight of my fear. The knocks echoed again, 3 hollow thuds, spaced with mechanical precision. They weren't loud, not enough to shake branches or startle birds, but they carried with an unnerving clarity, like someone striking a massive drum deep underground. With every repetition, they sounded closer, though the forest itself didn't betray a single tremor. I ran until my lungs tightened, forcing me to slow. My hands shook so violently I had to brace myself against a tree, gulping desperately at the cool air. My vision swam in pulses. The scent of damp soil clung to my nostrils, stronger now, almost metallic enough to taste. I tried to listen, for footsteps, for breathing, for the unnatural stillness that had trapped me before. But the forest felt normal, almost. The silence wasn't absolute anymore. A faint rustle of leaves drifted from somewhere above. A bird chirped once, then fell abruptly quiet as if scolded by the woods themselves. I didn't trust it. Normal meant nothing in these mountains. When I finally steadied myself, I scanned the ground for signs of the true trail. No blue flags, no bent grass, but the terrain sloped downward, and instinct told me to follow the decline. Water runs downhill, and trails generally follow water. I moved quickly, but not recklessly. Every few steps I stopped to listen, to check for the presence I felt earlier, the watching weight in the air. Nothing reached me except the slow whisper of the breeze, which felt like a relief until I realized it carried a strange rhythm. A pulse. My name breathed into the marrow of every gust. Not spoken, implied, as if the wind knew me. I clenched my jaw and forced myself forward. Branches scraped my arms, roots grabbed at my boots, my breath grew louder. The urge to sprint became a constant itch, but I fought it back. Panic would turn me into prey, and I didn't know yet what hunted these woods. Then, through the trees, I saw something that made my knees weaken. A sliver of man-made structure. A post, weathered, faded, sticking out from a patch of moss. My heart slammed with a mixture of hope and confusion. I pushed closer, brushing away leaves until the carving became visible. White paint. A number. 72. A trail marker. My relief lasted exactly 1 second before another realization punched through me. I'd entered the trail at marker 14. How the hell was I at 72? I hadn't hiked anywhere near that far. I hadn't followed a straight path. The terrain didn't match the map. The entire distance made no sense. I stared at the marker, shaking my head as if that could change the fact before me. But the number remained, clean, recent, untouched by time. Someone had placed this here, or something had rearranged the woods themselves. A shiver ran up my arms and settled in my teeth. I backed away, but the ground behind me felt softer than before, almost spongy, like it gave slightly under my heels. When I crouched to touch the soil, my fingers sank deeper than expected, into dirt too loose, too fine, like it had been overturned recently. My breath caught. It wasn't soil, it was ashes mixed with earth. I jerked my hand back, wiping it frantically on my pants as a sharp wave of nausea surged through me. The metallic scent intensified, clinging to my skin, refusing to fade. I stumbled away from the patch, barely able to breathe. Then the forest exhaled. Not wind. A long, low groaning sound, like the shift of wood under too much weight. The trees swayed, not as if moved by air, but as if something brushed against all of them at once. I froze, afraid even to blink. The swaying stopped, but far behind me, deep in the brush, the knocks resumed. 3. Hollow, measured, coming unmistakably from the direction of the clearing. My legs moved before my mind caught up. I ran, downhill over slick rocks and loose needles, ignoring the sting of branches slashing across my arms. I didn't look back, not once. The knocks kept pace with me, neither closer nor farther, always perfectly spaced, like something was stalking me but wanted me to hear it, as if the sound itself was the point. Minutes bled together. My breathing turned harsh and uneven. Then, through the trees, color flickered. White, square edges. The unmistakable geometry of a man-made object. The Volkswagen. Relief hit me like a punch to the chest. I broke through the tree line so fast I tripped, tumbling down the slope and landing hard against the gravel pad of my campsite. I rolled to my back, coughing, staring up at the sky that finally looked familiar again. Soft blue beneath drifting clouds instead of the gray suffocation of the deeper forest. I scrambled to my feet, sprinted to the van, and yanked the sliding door open. The interior smelled like home. Old upholstery, pine cleaner, sun-warmed fabric. For a moment, I felt safe. I slammed the door shut behind me, locked all 3 latches, and collapsed on the narrow bench seat. My heart hammered so violently the metal frame beneath me vibrated. But as the adrenaline slowly eased enough for my hands to stop trembling, something stabbed through the relief. The campsite was wrong. I looked out through the small side window, trying to place what felt different. The fire ring was the same. The tree line had the same angles. The gravel pad looked familiar. But the site next to mine, the one where the man in flannel had camped, was empty. Completely empty. No truck, no tent, no signs of fire, no gear, no footprints. The ground looked untouched, like no one had occupied it in years. I sat forward, breath catching in my throat. I didn't hear him leave. I didn't hear an engine. And even if he'd packed at dawn, there would have been tire marks or disturbed soil. But the campsite was pristine, too pristine. I stared so long my eyes dried out. Slowly, I edged the curtain back further and surveyed the campground road. Empty. Not a single vehicle. Not a single person. I had seen other campers hours before, scattered across loops A and C, preparing breakfast or packing gear. But now the place was deserted, as if swallowed whole. A quiet unease pressed into my chest again, stronger than before. I checked my phone. Still dead. Battery at 0, even though it had been half charged that morning. I plugged it into the van's auxiliary charger. Nothing. The phone stayed black, unresponsive. I tapped it, held the buttons, shook it. Dead. The forest outside remained unnervingly quiet. No engines, no chatter, no footsteps, not even wind. It felt like I had returned to a version of the campground that wasn't mine. A slight pressure shifted on the roof of the van, barely audible. A single, soft thump. I froze, pulse spiking so hard I tasted metal. The van creaked, just once, the unmistakable groan of the suspension reacting to weight. Something had climbed onto the roof, something heavy, something deliberate. My breath thinned into a whisper. I slid off the bench seat as silently as possible, crouched low, and pressed my back against the kitchenette cabinet. The van's thin metal skin suddenly felt like nothing more than paper keeping whatever was outside from stepping inside. Another sound followed. Not footsteps, breathing. Slow, deep. A heavy exhale that rolled across the roof like fog. I didn't dare move. The weight shifted slightly. A faint scrape passed overhead, like fingers dragging lightly across the metal. Then came 3 soft knocks, but this time they came from the roof, directly above me. My stomach twisted violently, my eyes stung, every instinct screamed not to make a sound. The knocks came again, closer together, almost curious. Then, silence.
The weight lifted slowly, the van rising almost imperceptibly as the pressure eased. I listened, waiting for movement, for retreating footsteps, for anything. But the world on the other side of the Volkswagen walls remained deathly still. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours. Only when the sun dipped lower and a pale, colder light spilled across the campsite did I gather the courage to move. I crawled up just enough to peer through a tiny gap in the curtain. The roof was empty. But the soil around the van, it was disturbed. Not footprints. Long streaks. Like something dragged its fingers through the dirt while circling the van slowly. My chest tightened until I could barely breathe. The forest had followed me back. And it wanted me to know I wasn't done with it. As the last of the daylight faded, something shifted in the tree line. A shape. A figure. Not the man from before, taller, thinner, posture sloping forward as if pulled by invisible strings. It stood motionless at the edge of the woods, facing my van, watching, waiting. Then slowly, it raised one arm and pointed directly at me. I didn't sleep. I didn't even pretend to. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of that marker on the tree, as if the pattern were burned into my eyelids. The shape wasn't complicated, but it hit me somewhere instinctual, like my mind recognized it before I knew why. I kept thinking of the missing girl, the campground host, the erased trails, the stories no one finished telling. Sometime after 3 a.m, the fog rolled in so heavily it swallowed the Volkswagen's windows. The glow from my little lantern didn't travel more than a foot before dissolving into white. There was no sound outside, no wind, no bugs, no crunch of branches. Just that unnatural blanket of silence that only the mountains seem capable of holding. I sat in the van's front seat, hands on the steering wheel, waiting for something I couldn't name. That uneasy dread, that pressure behind my ribs kept building, like something was about to happen. Something was watching the van. I couldn't prove it, but I felt it every second. When dawn finally arrived, it didn't feel like sunrise. The fog didn't burn off. It just grew lighter, like someone dimmed up the brightness a few notches. I stepped outside anyway, needing air, even though the cold soaked through my jacket instantly. My breath hung thick in front of me, drifting into the fog like it was being swallowed whole. The woods around my campsite were muted silhouettes. Nothing had shape until I walked right up to it. Every tree looked the same, straight, tall, quiet, and strangely featureless, like the forest itself was hiding its edges. I should have packed up and left right then, but something in me wouldn't. That same pull that made me drive up here in the first place, guilt maybe, or curiosity, kept nudging me deeper. I wanted to see the markers again. I wanted to understand what I had stumbled into. And there was another reason. A quieter one. I grew up hiking with my dad through places just like this, where silence meant safety and fog meant weather, not danger. We used to talk about how trails weren't made by people. They were revealed by walking them long enough. Paths appear when enough souls move through the same direction and trust the land to give something back. But sometimes, he said, a place doesn't want to be walked. I kept hearing his voice every time I thought about the missing girl. It was stupid, I know, but part of me felt responsible. I'd stood on the trail she vanished from. I'd seen markings no one claimed. I'd felt that wrongness in my bones. It didn't feel right to just drive away, pretend I hadn't noticed. So I grabbed my pack, zipped my jacket, and walked into the fog. The forest swallowed me almost immediately. My breathing felt too loud. My footsteps felt too sharp, like I was breaking some delicate rule by being here. But I forced myself to keep moving, scanning for the symbol I'd seen etched on the bark the day before. 15 minutes in, I found it. Same tree. Same symbol. But this time, there were 3 more beside it. Fresh, still wet at the edges. They wrapped around the trunk like a warning line. My stomach dropped. Someone had been out here last night, and they'd gotten a lot closer to my van than I ever heard. The next symbol appeared 20 minutes later, then another after that. Each one marked a direction that wasn't a trail, wasn't a path, wasn't anything, just deep woods. The more symbols I found, the more the forest felt wrong. The air smelled stale, like old stone. The
The silence pressed down heavy enough to make me swallow hard every few minutes just to hear something. Eventually, the ground started to change too. At first, I thought it was just uneven terrain, but the soil in some patches was darker, almost soft. Spongy, too easy to sink into. I stepped carefully around it, feeling a chill run up my spine because something about those spots didn't feel natural. They felt disturbed. The symbols began to cluster tighter the farther I went. At one point, I found a tree with 6 of them carved in different directions, like whoever made them had come back repeatedly, each time adding a new line. I stood there in the fog, staring at those carvings, trying to steady my breathing. Something about them felt frantic, almost desperate. As if the person making them wasn't marking a route, they were marking a boundary. I kept walking anyway. I don't know how long I'd been in the woods when I finally heard something, a low, distant thud. Not an echo, not an animal, a single heavy impact from somewhere farther north. Then another, then silence again. The fog started to shift around me, not clearing, but moving in slow currents like underwater clouds. My pulse hammered. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't. Not yet. The forest around me looked untouched, but something in the soil prints told me I wasn't alone. When the trail finally appeared, it shocked me enough that I stopped instantly. It wasn't marked, it wasn't maintained, it wasn't on any map. It was narrow, uneven, and looked like it hadn't been used in years. But it was a trail, a real one. The dense undergrowth parted perfectly down the center, leading deeper into the mountains. I stepped onto it, and the moment my foot touched it, something strange happened. The silence changed, it sharpened, like the woods were holding their breath. I crouched down, running my fingers along the dirt, and that's when I saw it. A footprint. Small, fresh, pointing forward. The heel was deeper than the toes, like the person was stumbling or running. My throat tightened. The girl, it had to be her. There were more prints ahead, leading down the narrow trail, leading into fog so thick it looked like a wall. I stood slowly, every muscle tight, every nerve on alert. This wasn't normal. None of this was normal. But I couldn't walk away. Not when I might be the only person who had seen these markers. Not when someone might still be out here. I followed the trail, step by careful step, watching the fog swallow the world to just a few feet around me. The trail twisted left, then right, then descended in a slow curve. I heard the faint thud again, closer this time, too close. I couldn't tell if it came from ahead or behind, because the fog bounced sound in strange ways. The woods no longer felt still, they felt like they were waiting. My breath grew shallow. Then I saw a shape emerge from the fog. At first, it looked like a fallen log. But as I got closer, the outline sharpened into something else, something man-made, something wrong. Something wrong. Sign. Old, weathered. Standing crooked as if shoved into the ground rather than placed there. The wood was cracked, the lettering so faded I almost couldn't make it out. I wiped the surface with my glove. 3 words emerged through the grime. But they weren't a trail name. They weren't even English. They were the same shape as the symbols carved into the trees. Only now, strung together, they looked less like random scratches and more like a warning written in a language no one used anymore. I took a step back, pulse spiking, when a new sound broke through the fog. Not a thud this time. A whisper, a voice so faint I couldn't make out words but definitely human, and it came from the direction the footprints led. The fog shifted, something moved in it, and I realized too late that the trail wasn't abandoned. It was hiding. I froze. Every muscle locked tight as the whisper threaded through the fog again. It wasn't loud enough to understand, but it carried an urgency I felt in my chest, like someone calling for help through water. I stepped forward slowly, each movement deliberate, my boots sinking slightly into the soft, disturbed soil. The footprints ahead of me became erratic, crossing over themselves, doubling back, then veering sharply off the trail for a few feet before returning. Panic had shaped those steps. Something had been chasing her, or driving her, or waiting for her. The whisper sounded again, closer now, and for a split second I almost answered. Instinct rose in my throat. that old human urge to respond to another voice in the dark. But the part of me that had grown up in places like this on trails where people vanished without a trace held my tongue. The woods can mimic anything if you stand in them long enough. I moved forward. A faint shape began to form ahead, like the outline of a figure leaning against a tree. My pulse hammered. I stepped closer, careful not to make sudden noise. The shape sharpened, shoulders, head, long hair hanging forward like a curtain. My heart lurched. It was her. I rushed forward, but my boots skidded as I stopped myself short, adrenaline crashing into my ribs when I realized what I was looking at. It wasn't her. It was a jacket. A faded blue hiking jacket snagged on a branch at human height, sleeves dangling limp like empty arms. It swayed slightly in the fog as if someone had torn it free and kept running. I reached out and touched it. Cold. Damp. Not long abandoned. My breath fogged the air in quick bursts as I followed the new trail of disturbed leaves. Up ahead, the forest thinned just enough for me to make out the faint outline of a clearing. The soil changed again, drying into a light gray color that reminded me of volcanic ash, fine and unnatural for Appalachian ground. And then everything went silent, not the soft, heavy silence I felt earlier. This was different. This was absolute. My footsteps didn't make sound. My breath didn't make sound. Even my heartbeat felt muffled. It was like crossing an invisible threshold where every natural law bent slightly out of shape. My skin prickled. The clearing opened to a circular space maybe 30 feet wide, ringed by old hemlocks and a handful of dead saplings leaning inward like skeletal ribs. In the center was a stone, about 3 feet tall, shaped like a tree stump worn smooth by centuries. Symbols were carved into every inch of it. The same symbols I'd followed through the woods. But these weren't frantic. They were deliberate, ancient, too thin and sharp to have been cut with any modern tool. And on the far side of the clearing, barely visible through the fog, lay a backpack. Her backpack. I recognized it from the search bulletin online, the small green osprey pack with a faded purple keychain hanging from the zipper. My chest tightened as I approached, half terrified of what I'd find beside it. The fog drifted. The thud sounded again, right above me, somewhere deeper in the trees. I looked up, trying to pierce the layers of shifting white, but saw nothing, just heavy fog and the outline of branches. When I crouched beside the backpack, I noticed something strange. There were no drag marks, no signs of a scuffle, no footprints except hers. She had walked here willingly, or been lured. I unzipped the pack. Inside were a half-full water bottle, a crushed protein bar, a small first aid kit, and a notebook, her handwriting on the cover. I opened to the last page she had written on. The ink was smeared, but the words were still legible. It's following me. It moves when I stop. It stands behind the trees where the symbols are. I can hear it breathing. My hands shook as I closed the notebook gently. This wasn't superstition. This was terror written by someone who believed she was about to die. And then I heard it, a breath. Not mine, not wind. A long, slow inhale from somewhere just beyond the fog's edge, deep and hollow like air passing through a cavern. I staggered back, heartbeat slamming against my ribs. The fog churned, and a faint shape moved between the trees. Too tall, too narrow, wrongly jointed at the angles. I blinked, and it vanished. My instincts screamed to run, but something else rooted me in place. Something hanging on the stone pillar at the center of the clearing. I stepped toward it, eyes fixed on a small object tied with twine. A pendant. Cheap metal. Scratched. Worn. The same pendant the missing girl was wearing in her photograph. I reached out and lifted it carefully. It was ice cold, colder than the air, colder than anything should be. The twine snapped, and the pendant dropped into my palm like a stone. The woods exhaled. The fog pulled inward from every direction, collapsing the clearing into a narrow circle of visibility. Shapes moved in the white. Dozens of them. Slender, tall, watching, waiting. Whatever was hunting her was now circling me. I backed away slowly, pendant clenched in my fist. When my boot hit the soft soil again, I felt it give under my weight. The earth sagged. Something inside shifted, and a hollow space opened beneath me. I stumbled back just in time as the ground collapsed, revealing a wide, dark pit lined with old earth and roots. At the bottom lay shapes, human shapes, bones, clothing, packs. More than one. More than a few. Dozens. People don't vanish from these mountains by accident. A sound ripped through the fog, sharp, violent, close enough to make me flinch. Branches snapped, something stepped toward me. I turned, expecting to see death coming through the fog. Instead, I saw a face. Not hers, mine. For a split second, the fog bent, forming a perfect mirror of me standing just a few feet away, eyes blank, expression hollow. My reflection didn't breathe, didn't blink, didn't move. Then its mouth opened far too wide. I bolted. I didn't think. I didn't look back. I tore through the fog, crashing through underbrush, ripping past the marked trees. The forest blurred. My lungs burned. Every footfall felt like running through water. Something paced me in the fog. Fast, silent, always a step behind. The symbols flashed by like warnings I had ignored too long. When I finally saw the faint glow of my Volkswagen through the fog, something in me broke. I sprinted the last 100 yards, slammed into the driver's door, and fumbled with the handle. The breathing was right behind me. Hot. Hungry. I dove inside, slammed the door, and twisted the ignition so hard I thought the key might snap. The engine roared to life with a cough, and the headlights cut a narrow tunnel through the fog. For a split second in the corner of the beam, I saw it. A shape. Tall. Wrong. Standing between the trees where no trail had ever existed. Then the fog swallowed everything. I floored the gas and didn't let up, not until the mountain was miles behind me. Not until the fog finally peeled off the windshield like something releasing its grip. And not until I realized something chilling. The pendant I found wasn't in my hand anymore. It was hanging from the rearview mirror, swaying gently as if someone had placed it there while I ran for my life. And the symbols carved into the trees, they were etched into the dust on my dashboard, fresh, waiting. I kept driving long after the road leveled out, long after the fog thinned into a pale morning haze that drifted like smoke above the asphalt. The mountains fell away behind me, but the feeling didn't. That tightening in my chest, that instinct that something had followed me into the world of normal things. The pendant swung gently on the rearview mirror, catching the early daylight and scattering it across the windshield in small, fractured glints. I wanted to rip it down, throw it out the window, leave it behind just like the girl had probably tried to. But every time I raised my hand to grab it, something inside me stopped. Something deeper than fear, heavier than superstition. I had seen her footprints. I had read her final words. I had stood on the edge of that pit filled with people no one remembered. And every time I blinked, I saw the fog tightening behind her, behind me, behind anyone who wandered too far off the map. Running wouldn't solve anything. I pulled off the highway into a small gravel turnout overlooking the valley. The engine clicked softly as it cooled. The world felt painfully normal. Birds calling from a nearby fence line, a far-off rumble of a diesel truck climbing a hill, sunlight warming the metal roof of my Volkswagen until it hummed. I sat there for a long while, head in my hands, trying to quiet the storm inside me. The fear wasn't sharp anymore. It had sunk into something more reflective, more honest. A quiet ache that made me confront the truth I had tried to outrun. I couldn't just walk away. The girl's name wasn't a headline or a bulletin post anymore. She wasn't a statistic or a cautionary tale. She was a person who had run through the same trees I had, breathing the same air, praying for someone to find her before the thing behind her finally closed in. Her backpack was still up there, her notebook. Her jacket caught on the branch like she'd reached for something and never touched it. Maybe she was still alive. Maybe she wasn't. But her story hadn't ended. It had been interrupted. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. I had two choices. I could pretend none of this happened, pretend the fog hadn't whispered, pretend the mirror image in the clearing hadn't opened its mouth like a broken jaw unhinging, or I could face it. For her. For me. For the countless people whose bones lay beneath the Appalachian soil because no one ever followed the symbols long enough to understand them. My Volkswagen had always been my refuge. My little home on four wheels where I hid from the world, searching for peace in trailheads and campgrounds that felt timeless and safe. But maybe this time safety wasn't what I needed. Maybe this time the van wasn't supposed to be shelter. It was supposed to be my way back. Before I could convince myself otherwise, I turned the ignition again. The engine rumbled awake. And that was when I saw it. A smudged handprint on the outside of my passenger window. Small. Feminine. Fresh. My breath froze in my throat. The handprint wasn't dusty like the dashboard symbols. It was clear, like someone had pressed their palm against the glass only moments before. It faced inward, not someone trying to get my attention from the outside. Someone who had been inside. I didn't panic. I should have. I should have bolted from the van and left everything behind. But instead, a strange calm washed over me, the kind that comes when fear reaches its peak and tips into something else entirely. Clarity. Maybe she had climbed in while I slept in the clearing. Maybe she had gotten close enough to warn me in whatever way she could. Maybe she wasn't gone. Not fully. I reached out and touched the glass. My fingertips aligned with hers. The chill of the window seeped into my skin, grounding me. A single beam of sunlight cut across the handprint and lit it up like a sign. It wasn't telling me to run. It was telling me to go back. To not let the trail vanish without a fight. I shifted the van into gear and pulled back onto the road, heading south to a place where the paved world dissolved into forest service routes. The further I drove, the more the air changed. Colder, sharper, familiar. And as the tree line grew denser, a new sound drifted in from somewhere deep inside the woods. Not the whisper from before, not the breath behind me. A voice. Faint, strained, calling, help. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, heart pounding, not with the raw fear that had driven me earlier, but with something steadier, determination, resolve. A promise I hadn't spoken out loud but felt with every step, every mile, every breath since leaving that clearing. People vanish on these trails because no one ever goes far enough to bring them back, because the forest learns from our fear, because silence becomes its camouflage. But I wasn't silent anymore. Not after what I saw. Not after what followed me. Not after what reached out for help in the last moment before the fog swallowed her whole. The mountains rose ahead like a wall. The fog waited somewhere behind them like a door. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I didn't feel like prey. I felt like someone returning with a reason. I downshifted as the gravel road steepened, the Volkswagen humming as it climbed toward the tree line. The pendant swung on the mirror again, slow, steady, like a heartbeat marking time. When the fog finally appeared in the distance, pale as memory and heavy as truth, I didn't slow down. I drove straight toward it. Because some trails don't vanish. They wait. For someone brave enough or foolish enough to walk back into them. And this time, I wasn't going alone. I had her handprint on the window, her voice on the wind, her story in my hands. And I wasn't stopping until I brought her out of those woods, or until the mountain decided it had taken enough. Either way, I was done running, and the fog knew it. The first night I ever feared my own heartbeat was the night the mountains stopped sounding like mountains. I remember that opening moment with a painful, perfect clarity, the way the dusk settled low over the Colorado RV trails, heavy and slow, like it wanted to bury every sound beneath it. My name is Rowan Hale, I'm 32, and if you had asked me a year ago why I liked camping alone in my Volkswagen near those trails, I would have told you it was the only place in my life that felt predictable, safe, honest. But that was before I learned how thin the curtain really is between the wilderness you enjoy and the wilderness that watches you back. I had driven out from Denver the previous afternoon, following a stretch of forest road that wound like a cracked spine through the Rockies. It was late September, the cold kind of late September where the air numbs you before it scares you. My plan was simple: hike during the day, record some footage for my channel, and sleep near the base of the North Ridge trailhead in my old silver Volkswagen Westphalia. I'd done trips like this dozens of times. I knew the trails, the weather patterns, the areas with bad cell service. I thought I understood what solitude felt like. I was wrong. The unease started long before anything scary happened, before the scratches, before the voice, before the night I thought I wasn't going to make it back to the van. It began with something much quieter. Silence. The kind that presses into your eardrums until you start listening for things that aren't there. That first afternoon, while setting up a small fire pit and leveling the van, I noticed how strangely muted the forest felt. Colorado forests are rarely still. You usually hear distant ATVs, hikers on gravel, wind shouldering its way through pines. But that day, the trees stood rigid, unbreathing. Even the birds were absent. I chalked it up to weather shifting. Storms often quiet wildlife before they break, but the sky was clean, the air painfully clear. I told myself not to overthink it, but it lodged in me like a splinter I couldn't quite dig out. Around sunset, after I'd eaten a quick dinner and reviewed some hiking footage, I grabbed my backpack and headed out for a short twilight walk, the kind I always took to settle my nerves before nightfall. The trail dipped between thick pines and then opened into a small meadow flanked by granite walls. The place was beautiful, but unnervingly empty. The grass didn't sway. The shadows didn't stretch. It felt staged, like nature holding its breath for a photograph. I kept walking. A few minutes in, I heard it, a single crunch of leaves behind me. I stopped instantly, looked over my shoulder, nothing. The trail behind me was empty, glowing faintly orange from the last sliver of sun cutting through the ridge. I told myself it was my own footfall echoing off the rocks. But then it happened again, closer. My body tightened without my permission. Not fear, not yet. Just a subtle readiness, like my bones recognized a pattern my brain hadn't caught up to. I scanned the tree line, squinting into the dim shapes between trunks. I didn't see movement, but I felt it. A shift, a weight. The sensation of something repositioning itself with the same slow patience as the dusk. Mountain lion, I thought, or elk, or a hiker heading back late. But the air didn't move like an animal was nearby, and I didn't hear breathing or hoofsteps. Only that single too close crunch now replaying inside my head. I kept walking, a little faster. By the time I got back to the van, night had folded fully over the mountains. I locked the doors immediately, a habit I learned younger when camping near trailheads that attracted people who didn't care about boundaries. But this time, the click of the lock felt different, like it was the only thing keeping the night outside from sliding in against my will. Inside the van, I turned on a dim interior light and sorted through my gear. Camera batteries, freeze-dried meals, my small emergency radio. The routine calmed me enough that I almost forgot the feeling from the trail. Almost. Around 10, the first sound came, a soft scrape along the exterior of the Volkswagen. I froze, one boot halfway off my foot. The sound was unmistakable, metal yielding, lightly, as if something dragged its fingers along the side panel. I killed the lights immediately. My breathing didn't sound like mine anymore. It came sharp and staggered. I waited, listening for footsteps, an engine, a voice, anything that would let me categorize the noise as human or animal. But there was nothing, just the emptiness pressing against the van. I waited a full minute before I moved again. I shifted to the back, peeking through the curtains. The darkness outside was too thick to separate shapes, only vague outlines of trees swaying slightly in the cold wind that had picked up. Wind, I told myself. Just wind. A low branch brushing the van. But I knew that wasn't right. The scrape was too controlled, too steady, too purposeful. I sat back on the bed platform, pulling my knees up. My instinct was to rationalize. Fear makes your senses invent patterns. I'd been tired. The silence earlier had put me on edge, and the mountains can make simple noises sound bigger than they are. I told myself to sleep, but sleep didn't come. Around midnight, the second sound broke the stillness. 3 slow knocks, not on metal, on glass, on the back window. Every muscle in my body locked at once. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I waited for another knock, another sign that this was a tired imagination turning thermal contraction into something more sinister. A full minute passed. 2. Nothing. The silence became its own language, heavy and invasive. My heartbeat was loud enough to drown out the ringing in my ears. I forced myself to move to the front seat as quietly as I could and reached for my flashlight. But something in me hesitated. The kind of instinct that doesn't come from logic, but from a deeper place, a place shaped by thousands of years of knowing when not to draw attention. I lowered the flashlight. Instead, I listened. That's when I heard breathing, not mine, not animal. Low, slow, human, coming from just outside the passenger door. I clamped my hand over my mouth to keep from gasping. My eyes blurred at the edges, not from tears, but from a surge of adrenaline so sharp it felt like electricity crawling up my spine. I leaned forward millimeter by millimeter until I could see a faint shadow shape through the window. Too tall for a crouching animal, too still for a person trying to stay warm. I stayed frozen like that for what felt like an hour, but the breathing didn't move, didn't fade, didn't quicken. It stayed steady as if whoever or whatever was outside wasn't waiting to get in. They were waiting for me to come out. It wasn't until the temperature dropped so sharply that condensation started forming inside the van that the breathing finally stopped. One moment it was there, the next, it vanished completely, like someone had been holding their breath the entire time. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Not with the knocks replaying in my head, not with the scrape echoing through my nerves, not with the outline by the window burned into my memory. But even then, even with all of that, I didn't know that the real danger wouldn't come from the person outside my van, but from the thing I followed the next morning. The first light of morning did nothing to calm me. It wasn't the warm, reassuring kind of dawn that burns away the shadows. It was a cold, bleached light, thin, metallic, like it barely managed to reach the forest floor. I stepped out of the van slowly, each movement small and deliberate, as if the ground itself might shift under my boots. The air smelled wrong. It wasn't the usual crisp, earthy scent of Colorado mornings. It carried the faintest trace of something chemical, something sharp, like the aftertaste of a firework or the inside of an old battery. Whatever it was, it made the back of my tongue buzz. I swept my gaze across my campsite. Nothing looked disturbed. Nothing was missing. But the feeling, that low hum of wrongness, was still there, growing roots in my chest. And then I saw them. Footprints. At first I thought they were mine from the previous evening, but I crouched down and felt my stomach twist. These weren't from boots, and they weren't from any animal I'd ever tracked. The prints were elongated, almost human, but too narrow at the arch, too deep at the heel, and spaced in a way that suggested a stride slightly longer than mine. They led from the tree line straight to the van, and then they stopped, not turned around, not continued past. Stopped. As if someone had walked right up to my vehicle and then simply vanished. I stared at those prints long enough that a halo of cold settled over me. Fear wasn't screaming yet, not the loud, frantic kind, but it pulsed, steady and insistent, like it wanted me to understand something I didn't have the courage to admit. Still, I forced myself to move. I grabbed my backpack, my camera, and the small thermos of coffee I'd brewed inside. I told myself I'd hike the short loop around the ridge, get some footage, and come back before noon. Keep the routine. Keep the mind calm. But right away, the trail felt different from the day before. The forest was awake now, but it was the wrong kind of awake. Ravens croaked harshly from crooked branches, and a distant woodpecker hammered in rapid, uneven bursts, each hit echoing like something breaking apart. The wind wasn't steady. It came in stuttering gusts that made the trees groan like strained joints. Every sound felt offbeat, out of sync, as if the wilderness was trying to mimic its own patterns and failing. I tightened the straps on my pack and kept walking. Half a mile in, I reached the spot where I'd heard the first crunch of leaves last night. The trail there ran between two tall granite outcrops that cast deep shadows even in daylight. I slowed, instinctively stepping softer. I scanned the rocks, the tree line, the ground. That's when I noticed the moss. It clung to the base of the left rock wall in a thick, wet layer, far denser than the small patches usually found at this altitude, and it was streaked with a darker color, something reddish-brown that made my stomach clench. I reached out without thinking, brushing the edge with my fingertips. It was warm, not sun-warmed. This part of the trail was still in shadow. This warmth felt internal, like the moss itself was holding body heat. I jerked my hand back and wiped it on my pants, a shiver running down my spine. I stepped away from the rock, but my curiosity tugged at me. I pulled out my camera and took a close-up shot. Sometimes weird things in nature make sense later, once you've stepped away from the tension of the moment. But the moment didn't let go. Because just as I snapped the photo, a voice echoed faintly from deeper in the woods. It wasn't a word, not at first. More like an exhale shaped into sound, a low, shaking murmur that seemed to vibrate the air rather than move through it. My breath caught in my throat. I spun toward the noise, expecting to see someone emerge from the brush, a hiker, a ranger, a hunter. No one was there. I scanned the trail behind me. Empty. I listened. Nothing. I told myself it was a deer or the wind catching a hollow log. But my body knew better. My pulse had dropped into that deep, ancestral rhythm, the one that tells you you're being watched. I kept hiking, but my pace was slower now, my senses stretched thin and tight like fishing line. At the top of the ridge, I reached a narrow overlook, a place where the forest opened into a sweeping view of the valley. The wind was stronger here, cutting across the exposed rock and carrying with it a strange, metallic chill. The same taste I'd noticed near my van that morning sparked at the back of my throat again. I lifted my camera to film the valley, but something made me pause. Movement. Far below, near the edge of the tree line, something shifted. A shape. Tall, thin, upright. It moved with a slow, odd gait. One step, pause, another step, pause, like someone walking barefoot on cold, sharp ground. I zoomed in, but even at maximum digital zoom, the figure blurred at the edges, as if the camera lens couldn't lock onto it. I held my breath, focusing hard. The figure stopped, and then its head turned, not toward the valley, not toward the trail, toward me. A wave of nausea rolled through me so abruptly I had to grip the edge of the overlook. The figure was too far to see a face, but I felt its gaze like a hand closing slowly around my spine. It didn't move again. Neither did I. Not until a cloud drifted across the sun and the light dimmed for just a heartbeat. When the brightness returned, the figure was gone. The valley looked untouched, silent, still, as if nothing had been there at all. I stumbled back from the overlook, adrenaline spiking like ice water through my veins. My instincts were screaming now, louder than they had all night. Leave, go back, get to the van, drive until the mountains disappear in the rear view. But some part of me, maybe the part that had grown up backpacking with my father, the part that believed humans always exaggerate danger in the wilderness, kept whispering, "Don't panic. You're alone. You're tired. You saw shadows moving in the distance." That's all. I clung to that lie like a lifeline. Until I reached the bottom of the ridge and found something stuck in the bark of a fallen aspen. A track, pressed deep into the pale wood. Same elongated shape as the footprints by my van. Same stride length, same narrow arch. The impression looked fresh, too fresh, like it had been made minutes before I found it. My hands shook as I crouched down. I traced the edge of the print lightly with my finger, half hoping it would break apart, prove itself old or weather-worn. But the bark was cleanly pressed inward, the fibers still springing slightly from the pressure. Whatever had made this had been here recently. Watching. Following. Moving parallel to the trail while staying hidden in the trees. I backed away from the fallen aspen, heart pounding so hard it hurt. My breath fogged in front of me, even though the air temperature hadn't dropped. Cold rose off the ground in pockets, swirling around my ankles. When I reached the fork in the trail, a 3-path split marked by a weathered wooden sign, I hesitated. My campsite lay straight ahead, but the left path led toward a narrow creek, and the right curved deeper into the forest before looping back near the ridge. I'd walked both before, but today the left path felt wrong. Too dark, too quiet, too expectant. So I turned right. I regret that choice every day of my life. Because I hadn't walked 50 yards before I heard the voice again. Clearer this time. Close. A trembling whisper that rose from the trees with a shape so familiar it hollowed me out from the inside. My name, spoken in my own voice. Rowan. The sound of my own name, spoken in my own voice, hung in the air like a thread pulled taut. I stood frozen on the trail, 1 foot a half step forward, my breath trapped somewhere between my chest and my throat. The forest around me didn't react. No birds scattered, no branches cracked. It was as if the world expected me to answer. I didn't. I couldn't. The voice had come from the right, deeper into the trees. Not far. Close enough that I should have seen someone moving. But the woods stood empty, and the silence that followed felt sharp enough to slice through the thin layers of calm I'd been clinging to. My first instinct was denial. Echoes. Weird acoustics near the ridge, a trick of fear and wind, the way mountains can distort sound. I told myself all of that as I tightened my pack straps and forced my legs to move again, but I didn't turn toward the voice. I picked up my pace and headed down the trail, every nerve in my body stretched tight. The path narrowed as it wound deeper into the pines. Their dense canopy turned the late morning light into something dull and filtered, like it had passed through smoke or dirty glass. The air chilled noticeably, enough that goosebumps prickled along my arms despite the layers I was wearing. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see movement. A figure, a shadow, something. But each time the trail behind me was clean and empty. Too empty, like the forest was clearing a path, removing anything that might obscure what was following. I reached the bend where the trail curved sharply left, hugging a steep drop-off. This stretch was narrow, the edge crumbling in places with loose shale that slid underfoot if you weren't careful. I'd crossed it before without issue, but today the slope felt deeper, hungrier. The drop to the ravine below seemed to pull at my balance with every step. And then I heard the footstep. One. Single. Soft. Exactly 2 paces behind me. I spun so fast I nearly slipped off the trail. My hand shot out, grabbing a pine branch for balance. My heart hammered in my throat. No one was there, but the pine needles beside me moved. Just a little. Just enough. I backed away slowly, boots scraping the dirt. I didn't want to turn my back to the slope again, not with something trailing me, something that had learned my voice. So I started walking backward, watching the trees, scanning every shadow, every flicker of movement. That's when I realized something was wrong with the silence. It wasn't complete anymore. It had a pulse, a slow rhythmic thrum beneath everything else, like a distant heartbeat echoing through the forest floor. I felt it in the soles of my boots, like something deep underground was stirring. I swallowed hard and turned forward again, picking up my pace. I wasn't running, not yet, but each step felt sharper, more urgent. When I reached the end of the narrow ridge path, the trail widened again into softer earth and moss. I exhaled shakily, letting myself believe for a moment that the worst had passed. But then the forest changed. It didn't happen gradually. It happened all at once. The air grew heavy, pressing against my lungs with the weight of altitude sickness. The light dimmed unnaturally, as though a storm had swept in. But when I looked up, the sky through the pines was still painfully clear. Even the smell shifted, earthy pine replaced by a damp mineral scent, like I'd stepped into the entrance of a cave. A few feet ahead, the trail forked again. And this time, the right path, the one I needed to take to loop back toward my campsite, was blocked. Not by branches, not by a fallen tree. By stones. Stacked stones, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Some small as fists, some large as helmets, arranged in tight, careful piles that rose up in jagged towers. They lined the trail on both sides, narrowing the passage into something that looked almost ceremonial. I stopped at the threshold. The stones weren't natural. They were deliberate, fresh, balanced in a way that defied the slow erosion of the area. Someone had built them, recently. And stuck between the stones on the tallest tower was something that made my blood run cold, a scrap of fabric, red, torn, caught by a thin stone at the top. My shirt. One I'd worn on a trip out here earlier that year. One I'd lost during a river crossing when a gust of wind had snatched it from the rock where it was drying. I stared at the fabric, my thoughts spiraling out of control. The river where I'd lost it was miles from here. There was no way it drifted upstream. No way someone randomly found it and placed it here. Someone or something had taken it, kept it, and waited. My mouth went dry. I stepped back, shaking my head. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't coincidence. Someone had been watching me long before last night, long before the footprints, maybe long before I realized anything was wrong. I forced myself to step closer to the stones. I scanned for other items, trinkets, markers, signs. That's when I noticed the carvings, tiny etched markings on some of the rocks, not symbols I recognized, not runes or initials or trail codes. They looked like repeated shapes, almost like tally marks, but curved, uneven, each slightly different from the next. They spiraled in a way that felt wrong, like they were meant to draw the eye inward into a place the mind wasn't meant to linger. A cold wave swept through me from the inside. I didn't touch the rocks. I didn't touch anything. I backed away slowly, turning onto the only remaining path, the left one, the one that dipped into the deeper, darker part of the forest. As soon as I stepped onto it, I felt watched again, not from behind, from above. The canopy shifted, the branches whispering in a way that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I felt it before I heard it. The faint creak of something climbing, something moving through the trees with a slow, deliberate weight. My stomach flipped. I didn't look up. I kept walking, each step faster than the one before. The path grew muddier, the ground wet, even though there'd been no rain. Soon my boots were sinking with each step, leaving deep impressions that filled slowly with dark water. The smell intensified, damp earth, minerals, something metallic beneath it all. And then, ahead of me on the trail, I saw it. A shape, crouched low, facing away from me. Human-sized, but too thin at the shoulders, too elongated in the limbs. Its skin, or whatever covered it, looked grayish in the dim light, stretched tight as if holding something inside it that wanted to push out. I froze. My breath hitched sharply, loud in the stillness. Very slowly, the shape lifted its head. Not fully, not all at once, but enough. Enough to reveal the side of its face, my jawline, my cheek, my hair matted and tangled, but wrong, distorted, like someone had seen me once and tried to carve me out of clay with shaking hands. The thing tilted its head slightly, like it was listening to my heartbeat, and then it whispered, "Rowan." Not an echo now, an invitation. I stumbled backward, heart slamming against my ribs hard enough to hurt. The creature, or the imitation of me, shifted slightly, its limbs bending at angles no human joints could sustain. Its head twitched sharply as if adjusting to the sound of my movement. I didn't wait for it to stand. I didn't wait to see its eyes. I turned and ran. Branches whipped against my face. Mud sucked at my boots. Roots clawed at my ankles. The forest wasn't just an environment anymore. It was a mouth trying to pull me deeper with every step. Behind me, the thing moved. I could hear it, the scrape of limbs, the wet slap of feet hitting mud, the low, trembling cadence of my own voice calling after me. "Rowan, Rowan." My lungs burned, my legs shook, the trail blurred under my frantic steps. I didn't know where I was running anymore. Only that stopping meant letting that thing close the distance. I crashed through a thicket of branches and burst onto an unfamiliar clearing, a flat stretch of packed earth, an old fire ring in the center, charred black. My chest heaved as I spun around, searching the trees. The forest had gone still again, dead still. But I knew it wasn't over, because somewhere between the trees, just beyond the line of shadows, I heard breathing. Slow, steady, patient, waiting. The breathing in the trees tightened something deep inside me, a knot of instinct older than language. I didn't move at first. I just stood there in the clearing, my pulse thundering in my ears, waiting for the next sound to break the thin layer of silence stretched too tightly over the forest floor. When the wind finally drifted through the pines, it felt like an exhale not my own. My first thought was to run back the way I came, but the trail behind me was gone. Not obscured, not hidden, gone. The branches I'd torn through had closed again, knitting themselves into a dense wall of limbs and needles as if the woods had swallowed the path whole. My throat tightened. The clearing was small, maybe 20 yards across, and every edge now looked the same. Dark tree trunks, slanted shadows, windless branches. I wasn't trapped in the clearing. I was contained. I forced myself to breathe in slow, quiet pulls, trying to steady my brain enough to think. The fire ring in the center was old, at least a decade or more. No prints, no gear, no remains of food or cans. Just ash hardened by years of wind and rain. I crouched and touched the edge of one charred stone. Dry, cold, untouched for years. So why did it feel like someone had been here recently? I circled slowly, keeping my back angled toward open space. I scanned the tree line for movement, any flicker of gray skin, any unnatural shift. The breathing had stopped, but the weight of attention hadn't. I felt it pressing against me, picking at the edges of my fear like fingers testing bruised skin. Then something gave beneath my boot. A crunch. Not leaves. Bone. I looked down and my stomach dropped. Half buried in the dirt, cracked and weathered, was the lower half of a deer skull. Antlers snapped. Eye sockets filled with earth. But what made my skin crawl wasn't the skull. It was the small, deliberate lines carved into the bone, those same curved tally shapes I'd seen etched into the stacked stones on the trail. I staggered back, breath sharp and shallow. That's when I heard the second sound, soft, rhythmic. Behind me, I spun again. This time there was movement. Not human, not animal. Something shifting in the shadow between two pines, as though the darkness itself had stepped closer. A shape leaned forward, tall, narrow, its proportions glitching in the corners of my vision. I blinked hard. It didn't help. The thing moved again, not toward me, along the tree line, circling. It stayed just far enough back that I couldn't see its full form, only hints, a flicker of a leg too long, the outline of a head that didn't quite match the body's angle, shoulders rising and falling like someone trying to rehearse breathing. I stepped back toward the center of the clearing, every instinct begging me not to turn my back on it. The air around me vibrated with the sound of my own heartbeat. Then the creature stopped and something else moved. A whisper of grass behind me. I turned sharply. Nothing. Then another sound, this time to my left, then behind, then right. Not footsteps, not breathing, tapping, like fingertips drumming lightly on tree bark. One tree, then the next, then another, moving around the clearing in an unmistakable pattern, like something marking its territory or closing a circle. My legs threatened to give out. I tightened my grip on my packed shoulder straps to steady myself. My chest felt like it was wrapped in wire. The tapping stopped abruptly, and a soft, low murmur drifted through the clearing. Words. My words. I told you not to come back. My knees nearly buckled. That was my voice, my exact inflection, from a video I'd posted years ago about hiking the same Colorado trails. I'd recorded that narration inside my van on a late fall night. I remembered the scratch in my throat, the fatigue weighing down my words. Hearing it here, echoing from the trees, it felt like a theft of something deeply personal. Then the murmur repeated, louder. I told you not to come back. But the tone was off now, warped at the edges, stretched, bent, as if the forest was trying to imitate me but couldn't quite fit my voice into its shape. My vision blurred. I forced myself to blink. I didn't know which direction the sound came from anymore. It was everywhere, surrounding me, pressing in. My breath trembled and my voice cracked as I whispered into the cold air, "What do you want?" Silence. Then a twig snapped behind me. I turned fast, expecting the creature, expecting that misshapen version of myself crouched in the shadows. But what I saw instead rooted me to the spot, a trail, narrow, fresh, cut perfectly down the middle of the clearing, leading into the deepest part of the forest. A trail that hadn't been there when I arrived. A trail lined with stones, those same tiny stacked towers, perfectly balanced on either side, as if inviting me to step inside. No. Not inviting. Directing. Something behind me shifted. The faint scrape of a limb dragging lightly across bark. My breath stuttered. The air dropped sharply in temperature. A cold so sudden, it made my teeth ache. The forest wanted me to take that path. Every cell in my body screamed not to, but something else, a sensation I couldn't shake, pushed forward. A pull, a familiarity, like an echo of memory brushing the back of my mind. I stepped closer to the entrance of the narrow trail despite myself, staring down its dark, twisting corridor. The stones vibrated slightly, the smallest tremble, like they were reacting to my presence. A whisper broke the tension. Close. Right over my shoulder. Rowan. I didn't turn. I ran. I sprinted straight into the narrow path, branches clawing at my arms, stones wobbling underfoot. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The thing behind me crashed into the clearing, its limbs tearing through branches, scraping bark in a frenzy of movement. The forest around me distorted, trees pulling inward, shadows thickening, the ground sloping in ways that made no geological sense. It felt like running through a place trying to rearrange itself faster than I could navigate. I stumbled over a root, caught myself, kept running. The trail twisted sharply left. I followed, crashing me another turn, right. I followed, a flash of gray skin between trunks, another left, another breath not my own, another right. My mind spun, direction dissolving into instinct. My lungs screamed, my legs ached, my boots sank deeper into soft earth that squelched like wet clay. I didn't stop. Not until the trees suddenly thinned and the forest spat me out into a wide slope of rock and gravel. I skidded to a stop, gasping, my chest burning. Below me, far below, the valley spread out in pale afternoon light, the ridge trail, the overlook. Familiar terrain. I was out, alive. But not safe, because as I turned to look behind me, the forest stood unnaturally still. No wind, no movement, no sound, and perched in the shadow beneath the very first pine was my camera. The one I'd dropped during my panic, propped upright, pointed directly at me as if something had been filming my escape. I didn't move toward the camera at first. I couldn't. The sight of it, standing upright on its small, collapsible tripod legs, angled with unsettling precision, struck me with a fear different from being chased, different from the breathing or the mimicry. This fear sat deeper, older, because that camera hadn't just been dropped or lost. It had been placed, arranged, presented, almost like an offering. My breath went shallow as I stared at it from across the rocky slope. The sun hit the lens at just the right angle to make the glass look like an eye, a single unblinking pupil watching me, judging me, wanting something from me. I took one step forward, then another. Gravel shifted under my boots, loud in the open stillness. My heart pounded so loudly I half expected the camera's microphone to pick it up. The farther I walked, the more the slope seemed to tilt subtly uphill, even though I knew it should be downhill. My boots scraped rock at strange angles, my balance wavered. The mountain was playing tricks on perspective, or something on the mountain was. I stopped within arm's reach. My shadow stretched over the camera like a warning, but the thing didn't tip or fall. It stood impossibly steady. I crouched and reached out, feeling a cold coil in my stomach tighten with every inch my hand moved forward. I expected the camera to be warm, to have been recently handled, but when my fingers closed around it, the plastic was ice cold, deep cold, subsurface cold. The kind that comes from something stored underground or underwater. A shiver ran down my spine. I pressed the playback button with my thumb. The screen flickered. For a moment, nothing. Then static, but not the frantic, chaotic static of a damaged file. This static had rhythm, pulsing in waves, almost breathing. Underneath it, buried faintly in the distortion, was a sound that made my skin crawl. My own voice. But not the older recordings, not the trail videos. This was newer, closer. It was me from the forest, me running, me gasping, me panicking. Footsteps thundered through the audio, too close, too loud, as if something had been filming while sprinting just behind me. I froze, because I hadn't been holding the camera then. I pressed pause, hands trembling, and stared up at the tree line. The forest above looked utterly still, but that stillness didn't comfort me. It felt staged, like a pose. I shut the camera off and stuffed it deep into my pack, zipping it tight. I didn't want to hear my own fear played back again. Not here. Not now. My only focus became getting back to the van, down the slope, down the ridge, into familiar territory, to keys, to metal walls, to an engine that could carry me far from whatever had followed me. I turned toward the valley and started walking. The descent was steep, but I moved fast, boots finding small footholds between loose stones. The air warmed slightly as I dropped in elevation, and for a brief moment, I let myself believe I was outrunning whatever had been stalking me. The sun cut across the mountains at a low angle, filling the valley with a burnt gold glow that felt almost normal. Almost. But every few steps, I kept glancing over my shoulder, and each time I saw nothing, no figure, no movement, no thing wearing my face, just the slope and the trembling shadows of branches. Still, I didn't stop. I didn't slow. When I finally reached the tree line near the base of the ridge, my legs were shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. Sweat chilled against my spine. I paused only long enough to orient myself. A trail marker stood a few yards ahead, a small wooden sign pointing toward the North Ridge trailhead. My van was less than a quarter mile from here. I swallowed hard and kept walking, but the closer I got, the quieter the woods became. Not peaceful quiet. Dead quiet. Bird song vanished mid-note. The breeze stilled. Even my own footsteps felt muffled, as if sound itself had thinned out around me. My vision sharpened with the kind of fear that sits at the border of panic. I turned the last bend before reaching my campsite and stopped dead. My van wasn't where I left it. For a moment, I thought I'd taken a wrong turn, panic clawing at the edges of my brain. But I recognized the split rock formation, the small meadow, the exact ground where I'd parked. I walked forward slowly, heart slamming against my ribs. There was no Volkswagen, no tire tracks, no sign of anything having been there at all. Just untouched earth, untouched grass, a clean, undisturbed clearing. I took a step back, legs suddenly weak. My mind raced in jagged, frantic lines. Did someone steal it? Tow it? Why would anyone tow a van from a backcountry trail? Did I park somewhere else? Did I misremember? I forced myself to breathe, to think. I dropped my pack and spun in a circle, scanning for any trace, any clue. But the clearing wasn't just empty. It was wrong. Too pristine, too uniform. Not a single blade of grass bent. Not a patch of dirt disturbed. As if no vehicle, no weight, had sat here in decades, and stillness pressed against my skin like a cold palm. Something rustled behind the tree line. I spun toward the sound. A shape moved between the pines, slipping out of the deeper shadows into the thin strip of afternoon light. My stomach dropped. It was me. Or rather, something wearing me like a memory that didn't fit right. The posture was wrong, stiff, tilted slightly to one side, the limbs too long, dangling as though the joints had been stretched. The head turned slowly, the neck bending with a soft crack. The face was almost mine, but the eyes, they were hollow impressions, shaped like mine but empty. Like someone had molded them from clay with their thumbs, my voice came from the creature again, strained, wet, broken. Rowan. I stumbled backward, bile rising in my throat. The thing stepped forward, its feet dragging, its shoulders twitching with each motion. It extended one trembling hand toward me, fingers too many, too thin, and for a moment my brain couldn't process the shape of what I was seeing. It took another step, and the forest behind it pulsed, not with light, not with sound, with movement. Dozens of shapes, tall, thin, human-like but not, shifted between trees. Their silhouettes leaned, twisted, bent. Some hunched, some crawled, some tilted their heads at unnatural angles, as if listening for how fear changes a heartbeat. I backed away, hands shaking uncontrollably. Every instinct, every survival impulse screamed the same thing: run. But then something else moved. Not in the trees, behind me. I spun. The clearing was no longer empty. My van was there, right where I had left it, like it had blinked into existence. Every window dark. Every door closed. The metal shell reflecting the last burn of sunlight. Relief surged through me so violently it felt like pain. I bolted toward it, stumbling across the clearing. My hands shook as I grabbed the door handle, half expecting it to be locked. It wasn't. It swung open easily. Too easily. I hesitated, just for a second. And in that second, the forest behind me went silent. Not quiet, silent, as if everything had stopped breathing at once. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see the tree line over my shoulder. They were all standing there, every shape, every mimic, motionless, watching me with empty impressions where eyes should be, waiting for me to make one more choice. My breath shuddered. I stepped into the van. I should have slammed the door. I should have driven. But the moment my foot crossed the threshold, something inside the van exhaled, warm, close, right behind me. The breath on the back of my neck was warm enough to cut straight through the cold that had been tightening around me since dawn. I didn't turn around, didn't blink, didn't breathe. Every instinct in me, the animal part, the ancient part, locked in place, telling me that whatever was behind me was inches away, close enough to touch, close enough to smell. Slowly, without thinking, I reached out and grabbed the interior handle of the sliding door. But the van door didn't move, not jammed, held. A faint pressure pressed against it from the outside, like a hand bracing the metal. My chest seized. My pulse hammered in a nauseating rhythm. The warm breath behind me came again, longer this time, trembling, almost human. Then I heard something shift. Not clothing, not fabric, skin, stretching, a soft, wet sound. I snapped. I spun around, throwing my full weight backward to get away from whatever was in the van, and I saw nothing. The van was empty, but warm. Too warm, like someone had been sitting inside it, like they'd been breathing here for hours. My vision swam. I staggered back, collapsing against the passenger seat. My mind fought to make sense of the impossible. Outside, the forest stood completely still. The shapes in the tree line hadn't moved, not a step forward, not a step back, frozen, waiting, like they were giving me a chance to understand something. That terrified me even more. I forced myself upright, shaking violently. I slammed the sliding door closed, locked it, and lunged for the driver's seat. My hands fumbled with the keys in my pack pocket. The air inside the van felt thick, humid, heavy with something I didn't want to name. I shoved the key into the ignition. Turned. The engine coughed, stuttered, then caught. Relief hit me so hard I nearly sobbed. The steering wheel vibrated beneath my palms, grounding me. The headlights cast two pale shafts of light across the clearing, and that's when the figures moved. Not all at once. One, then two. Then every shape in the tree line tilted its head at the exact same angle, like a synchronized breath drawn by a single unseen lung. My own distorted voice echoed faintly through the forest. Don't leave. I shifted into gear. Rowan. I slammed my foot on the gas. The van lurched forward. The shapes vanished into the trees like they'd melted into shadow. Branches snapped. Something scraped along the rear panel of the van as I peeled out of the clearing and onto the narrow dirt road. The sound was long, drawn out, fingernails on metal. I didn't look back. Not once. I kept my eyes locked on the winding road ahead as dusk swallowed the sky. Every turn felt too tight, every dip too steep. The van rattled violently, suspension groaning against the rocky terrain. The rearview mirror shook with each bump, vibrating until the reflections inside it blurred. But even blurred, I saw movement in it. Shadows. Tall ones. Keeping pace with the van. I gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles burned. The forest on both sides of the road twisted into streaks of black and green as I sped downhill. My breath came short, ragged. My heart wouldn't slow. I pressed harder on the gas. The trees thinned. The air warmed. The trail opened. I burst out of the forest and onto the gravel road that led toward the main RV route. I didn't stop, didn't slow, didn't think. My entire body was one instinct now. Distance. Distance from those trees, from those voices, from the impossible shape wearing my face. By the time I reached the first paved road, the sun had fully dipped behind the mountains, leaving only a thin smear of fading gold in its wake. My VW rumbled forward, the headlights cutting through the encroaching blue of night. I glanced in the rearview mirror again. This time, nothing followed. The forest line was still, unmoving, silent. But I didn't feel safe, not even when I reached the tiny ranger station 2 miles down the road. I swerved into the parking lot, gravel spraying under my tires, and stumbled out of the van before it had fully stopped. My legs nearly gave out. I slammed the door and ran inside. The station was empty. A single desk lamp cast a yellow circle of light over a stack of maps. A radio crackled faintly. A half-drunk cup of coffee sat cooling beside a clipboard. No ranger, no voices, no signs of anyone. But the door was unlocked and the room was warm. Too warm, like someone had just left. I approached the desk, grip shaking around the edge of the counter. My voice cracked as I called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" Silence. Then a sound behind me, a soft thump. I turned slowly. The camera was sitting on the floor by the door. My camera. The one I had zipped inside my backpack. The pack was still open in the van. The camera wasn't supposed to be here. I stepped back, my stomach collapsing inward. The door stood slightly ajar, the cold night air pushing gently through the gap. The camera lens pointed at me from the floor, angled perfectly, unnervingly. I felt watched, studied, chosen. I knelt, hesitated, then hit the playback button. The screen lit up with a new video file. Timestamp, 10 minutes earlier. A shot of me running toward the ranger station, filmed from behind, filmed by something that wasn't holding the camera with human hands. My breath hitched violently, because the shot didn't show just me. It showed the forest behind me, the shapes, leaning, watching, waiting. But one shape, one, stepped out onto the gravel road just as I reached the ranger door. It leaned forward, tilted its head, and whispered something I couldn't hear until I pressed the volume all the way up. My voice, but older, tired, something like regret woven through it. "Rowan, you should have stayed." The video ended abruptly. I turned toward the door again, fearing someone standing there, but the doorway was empty, except for one detail, one that nearly buckled my knees. Fresh footprints, not boots, not paws, those same elongated impressions from the clearing in the stones. Leading away from the ranger station, not toward the woods, toward the road, toward civilization, toward people. My mouth went dry, my legs shook, because the footprints didn't wander randomly. They followed the exact path my van would take if I kept driving, as if whatever was out there wasn't done with me, as if it knew the roads I would choose, as if it still wanted something. The prints leading away from the ranger station glowed faintly in the beam of the exterior floodlight, elongated, narrow, too deep at the heel. I stared at them until my vision began to swim. Something inside me, some instinct that belonged more to my ancestors than to me, kept whispering that the mountains had not let me go. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I backed slowly into the station, closing the door until it latched with a soft click. The lock felt flimsy in my hand, a thin piece of metal pretending it could keep out a thing that bent itself into my voice. My chest tightened. Every breath stung. I glanced at the radio on the desk. A trail map sat beneath it. A set of keys hung on a hook by the door. Tools. Ordinary things. Human things. They should have grounded me, but they didn't. Because nothing about this place felt untouched. The warmth in the room was heavy, humid, as if breath had collected and clung to the walls. The faint scent of pine and sweat floated in the air. Someone had been here, recently, minutes ago. But whoever they were, they'd walked into the night without turning off the light or finishing their coffee, or they'd been taken. I tried the radio. Static. Tried the switch. Nothing. The entire board was dead, intentionally disconnected or drained by something I didn't want to imagine. The camera still rested on the floor where I dropped it. I crouched, hesitated, and then picked it up by the strap, careful not to touch the lens. The plastic felt warm, too warm, like something had been holding it only moments before. A low hum vibrated through the air. Not mechanical, not electrical, mountain hum, like a distant, buried signal pulsing through the ground. And that was when I realized something terrifying. The hum wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from beneath the floorboards. My heartbeat stuttered. "No," I whispered. "No, no, no." Something creaked beneath the station, slow, heavy, deliberate, a dragging sound, like something shifting through soil. I backed away from the center of the room, eyes locked on the floor. The boards trembled slightly, dust drifting from between the slats. My breath grew thin, sharp, panicked. I didn't think. I bolted. I threw myself out the front door, sprinting across the gravel so fast my boots barely made contact.
I slammed the van door shut behind me, jammed the key into the ignition, and prayed the engine wouldn't choke like before. It roared to life. Thank God. I tore out of the parking lot, gravel spraying behind me. The ranger station shrank in my rearview mirror, its windows flickering as though a light inside had gone out, or something had moved in front of it. I didn't look back again. The mountain road twisted in front of me like a dark ribbon, headlights slicing through pine shadows. I pushed the accelerator harder, the VW's engine crying in protest but obeying. Every turn felt too sharp, too narrow. Every tree looked too tall, leaning inward as though listening. The hum wasn't gone. It followed. Soft, low, pulsing beneath the wheels, like the mountain was moving with me. I gripped the wheel tighter. Just get to the highway, I whispered. Get off the back roads. Get to light. Get to people. But the mountain had one more lesson for me, because the farther I drove, the more I realized the road ahead wasn't familiar. I should have passed a wooden sign, a fork, a switchback curve that hugged a cliff on the right. None of it came. Instead, the road stretched straight, too straight, and the trees pressed closer. I slammed the brakes. The van skidded across loose gravel, tires screaming. Dust clouds swirled in the headlights. My breath fogged the windshield. Slowly, terrified, I stepped out of the van. The road I was on was not a road. It was something the forest had cleared, a path cut just wide enough for a vehicle. The tire tracks behind me faded into unbroken dirt. There were no other roads, no signs, no markers, just darkness and silence, and the feeling that the entire forest was holding its breath. I spun toward the tree line, adrenaline blazing through tired nerves. That was when I saw it. Standing 20 yards back in the shadows, tall, thin, my shape, my face, my outline, but impossibly wrong, like a reflection on rippled water. The limbs bent at quiet angles. The head tilted. The chest rose and fell with slow, heavy breaths. It stepped forward, and with it, dozens of others emerged behind it, shuffling, tilting, leaning, filling the spaces between trees. A forest of mimics, every one of them shaped almost like a person, almost like me. My voice rose from them all at once, a chorus of distorted whispers. Rowan. I backed toward the van, heart slamming against my ribs. My thoughts scattered like broken glass. I felt the forest press inward, folding around me like a mouth. The lead shape, my shape, stepped forward again. Closer, and something inside me snapped. No, I shouted, voice cracking under the weight of terror. I'm not going with you. The forest shuddered. A ripple of movement spread through the mimics. Then the lead one bent its head, almost curious, almost disappointed. It whispered, "You already did." Then the hum beneath the earth surged. The trees bent inward like drawn by a single breath, and the ground beneath my feet vibrated. I made a choice then, a human one, a desperate, instinctive, terrified one. I dove back into the van, slammed the door, shifted into reverse, and floored it, spinning the van in a wild half circle that nearly sent me into a ditch. I didn't care. I gunned the accelerator, steering blindly into the dark, letting instinct guide me. Branches snapped against the sides. Boulders ricocheted under the tires. Something hammered the back panel. But I kept driving, kept pushing, kept refusing whatever fate waited for me in those trees. When the forest finally broke open into a real road, a paved, familiar stretch of Route 14, I nearly collapsed from relief. I drove until the sun rose. Then I drove past that. I didn't stop until I reached a crowded gas station on the outskirts of Fort Collins. When I stepped out of the van, sunlight burned my eyes and people moved around me like soft, harmless shapes. Humans, normal humans, breathing, talking, not watching. For the first time since the ridge, I felt something like safety. But the story doesn't end there, because when I opened the passenger door of the van to grab my backpack, a scrap of red fabric lay on the seat, the same scrap from the stone towers, the same shirt I'd lost in the river months earlier. But this time, it wasn't torn, it wasn't weathered, it was folded, neatly, placed with care, like a gift, or a reminder, or a promise. My voice trembled when I whispered into the sunlight, "What do you want from me?" No answer came, but I felt the mountains behind me, watching, waiting, patient. And in that moment, I understood something I wish I didn't.
Some trails don't want you to return. Some forests don't want you to leave. And some things, once they learn your shape, they never forget it. I never thought a voice sent through a speaker could change the way I breathe, but the moment I pressed play on that first message, the air in my Volkswagen felt different, thicker, almost metallic, like the world outside had shifted without warning. I didn't know yet that these voices would follow me across states, across nights, across empty campgrounds, where the wind didn't just whistle through trees, but seemed to repeat the same broken syllables again and again. But it's always like that. Quiet unease arriving first, almost polite, before anything darker learns your name. My name is Colton Rise. I'm 36 years old, and most people who watch my channel only know me as the guy who's spent half his life wandering the United States in a beat-up Volkswagen Westphalia that rattles during every cold front. I grew up in southern New Mexico, the kind of place where the sky has no lid and shadows stretch long even at noon. I think that's where I first learned that silence can be frightening if you give it enough space. I think that's why, when your stories started coming in, these so-called viewer encounters, I felt something familiar settle into my chest. Not panic, not curiosity, something older. Recognition. The story that changed everything came from a man named Eli, who said he camped every year with his wife at the same hidden pull-off in northern Arizona. He sounded tired in his recording, like each word carried weight he didn't want to touch. He said he wasn't looking for answers. He said he just needed someone else to hold the memory long enough for him to breathe again. And I didn't know why, but that night, parked off a forest road near Flagstaff, I felt an obligation, no, a pull, to hear him out entirely before the dark had a chance to reshape his truth. So I sat in the back of my van, the little LED strip glowing yellow above the kitchenette, and pressed play. He said the first night had been warm, unremarkable, until the smell arrived. Not rot, not smoke, but something in between, like rainwater soaked into old wood from a house that burned a century ago. He said it rolled across the campsite with no wind carrying it. His wife thought it was a dead log. He thought it was nothing. And that's where it began. Denial. Denial. The quiet shield we raise when instinct whispers a warning we're not ready to accept. I paused the message right there. I don't know why, but the smell he described sat too close to something I knew myself. Because I've been around enough places that have burned down to know that leftover smoke, even decades later, has a memory of its own. It clings. It presses. It lingers in ways you can't wash off. I stepped outside my van just to clear my head. But stepping out didn't help. The trees around me were too still. The cold too sudden. It was like the forest wanted me to go back inside and finish listening. I got back into the van and started the message again. Eli said the second night was when the tapping started. Soft, measured, 3 knocks on the back of their camper. No animal sounds before or after. Just 3 knocks, spaced too evenly to be random. And every time he considered opening the door, something in his chest told him not to. Not fear exactly, more like dread wearing a mask of logic. He said the tapping didn't follow a pattern, not a traditional one anyway, but if he listened closely, he could swear the cadence matched his heartbeat. A detail his wife never heard because somehow the knocks only came when she was asleep. That was when I paused the recording again, because I've heard knocks like that. I've felt that exact rhythm. Like something outside the walls of your shelter is syncing itself with your pulse to learn the shape of you, to learn your pace, your timing, your hesitation. And for a moment, sitting there in my van, I became too aware of my own heartbeat, too aware of how thin the sheet metal around me really was. The next part of his recording came with a tremble. On the third night, he said the tapping grew louder, not violent, not aggressive, just certain, like whoever or whatever it was had grown confident. He said he finally woke his wife and they sat together in silence, listening. The knocks traveled from the back to the sliding door, pausing just long enough to be intentional. Then up toward the rear window, then back down, like something walking its fingers across the entire frame of their camper. He said his wife whispered, "It's looking for a way in." That line stayed in my head longer than it should have. Eli said he didn't open the door. He couldn't. And when morning came, the campsite looked untouched. No tracks, no damage, no disturbed pine needles. Except he paused then in the recording as if deciding whether to continue. There were smudges. Long, pale smudges on the glass of the rear window, like fingerprints dragged downward, like something tall had pressed its hand there. He and his wife left that morning. They never returned to that spot again. When the recording ended, my van felt too small, too fragile. The kind of fragile you only notice once your mind starts rearranging your surroundings into possible escape routes. I turned off the lights, sat still, and listened. Not for knocks, not for footsteps, just for changes in the quiet. But the quiet was the problem. It wasn't empty. It had intention. That's something you learn when you camp alone long enough. Silence isn't always the absence of sound. Sometimes it's a presence, waiting for an opening, pressing against your edges until you're forced to acknowledge it. I slept horribly that night. Dreams that weren't mine drifted through my head like foreign memories. Burnt wood, dragging fingers, a heartbeat I didn't recognize syncing up with something outside myself. When I woke before sunrise, there was condensation on the inside of my van windows. Not unusual. But there were 2 streaks cutting through the fogged glass, 2 long smears, as if someone dragged their fingers downward from the top of the window while I slept. Not 5. Not a hand. Just 2. 2 slow downward lines. And I told myself it was moisture. I told myself maybe I brushed against the glass without realizing. But deep down, the part of me that grew up under endless, merciless desert skies, the part that knows when something is wrong, knew better, because the streaks were on the outside of the glass. That morning, as I drove toward the Navajo Nation, I couldn't shake the feeling that Eli's story was no longer his alone. That maybe these encounters, these strange things that happen to people who camp far from others, weren't random, isolated events. Maybe they were connected in ways we don't want to imagine. And that's when your messages began to flood in. Hundreds of them. People telling me about strange shadows around their vans, voices mimicking loved ones, footsteps circling campsites where no one else should be, lights that didn't belong to any ranger or hiker or passing truck, but one story, the one that pulled me deeper than I intended to go, came from a woman named Grace, parked in a remote campground in Utah. A story she said she had never shared with anyone until now. A story that began with a voice whispering her name from just outside her tent. A voice that belonged to her brother who had died 3 years before. And when I read those words, something cold moved down my spine in a straight, deliberate line. Because that wasn't the first time I'd heard a story like that. And it wasn't the first time I'd encountered something I couldn't explain myself. I didn't open Grace's message right away. Something in the way she wrote, too measured, too calm, made me feel like I needed to be somewhere safer before hearing the rest. But safety is a strange thing on the road. Sometimes it's the presence of others. Sometimes it's a locked door between you and the dark. And sometimes, no matter how thick the walls around you are, safety just refuses to exist. I was camped that evening along a narrow ridge road outside Zion. My Volkswagen sat slightly leaned to one side, the way it always did when the terrain didn't quite match the leveling blocks. The wind pushed against the canvas pop-top in slow, dragging breaths, giving the van the illusion of something alive. I lit a small lantern, set it on the counter, and finally pressed play on Grace's voice message. Her voice was controlled at first, almost too controlled, like someone holding a shaking glass so tightly they forget their hand is shaking. She said her encounter happened last fall during a solo trip through the Utah backcountry. She'd lost her brother, Michael, to a climbing accident 3 years earlier. She didn't linger on that fact. She didn't have to. Grief has a sound, and it carved itself into every syllable she spoke. She said she had parked her camper in a quiet, primitive spot, far from the established loops. She liked isolation. She liked stillness. But that night, the stillness felt wrong, too thick, too present. She said she felt watched before she ever heard the voice. I paused the message, instinctively scanning the darkness outside my own windows. The ridge was silent, but something in that silence felt weighted, like the night itself leaned closer when I mentioned her story aloud. I swallowed and pressed play again. Grace said she'd been asleep when someone whispered her name. Not shouted, not called, whispered, right beside the thin canvas of her tent. The voice had the same soft rasp her brother used to have when he was exhausted after a long day on a cliff face. She said she sat up immediately, heart pounding so hard she felt it in her teeth. Michael? She almost said it aloud. Almost. But something in her froze. Because grief doesn't resurrect voices. And even if it did, they wouldn't sound that close. Right against the tent wall, right next to her ear. She unzipped the tent slowly, thinking maybe a hiker was lost, maybe someone needed help. But there was no one, just the dark brush line and the faint outlines of juniper branches trembling in the breeze. Then she heard it again, but not whispered this time, spoken, directly behind her. Grace. I stopped the recording and felt every muscle in my back tighten, because that detail, the change in location without movement, the way a voice could shift positions between breaths, that's something I had heard before, from 3 different viewers, from one ranger, and once from myself. I steadied my breathing and pressed play. Grace said she spun around so fast she nearly fell, flashlight beams slicing through the empty dark like a blade. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. But she said she wasn't imagining it. Not because of fear, because of what she felt. She said the air behind her had changed to something colder, something she described as emotionless cold. Not like wind, not like altitude, but like stepping into a room where someone had just died. She backed into her tent, zipped it, and sat with her knees pulled to her chest, trying to convince herself that grief can make the mind misfire. That loneliness can make sound bend. But the voice came again, this time not saying her name, this time saying, "Let me in." And according to Grace, the voice didn't sound like her brother anymore. The moment she said those words in her recording, something inside me snapped awake. My breathing grew shallow, my vision thinned, because the phrase "let me in" is not unique. It's a phrase I've heard dozens of times in these viewer stories, from the Appalachians to the deserts, from the coastlines to the redwoods, different states, different voices, same phrasing, same eerie repetition. Grace said she didn't sleep that night, not even for a second. She remained frozen until sunrise, when the voice finally stopped. When she stepped outside, she saw tracks, not boot prints, not animal marks, but long, dragging streaks around the perimeter of her tent, as if something had circled her repeatedly on its knees. And when she looked closer, she realized the circles weren't random. They were patterns, spirals. A spiral tightens inward, toward the center, toward her. Her voice cracked when she finished. Not from fear, she'd already lived through that, but from shame. She said she should have left the state after that. She said she should have warned others, but she didn't. She drove to the next campground, told herself it was grief, told herself the desert played tricks. We all do that. We rationalize the things we're not ready to face. I breathed out slowly, but my chest didn't release. Something about her story thudded too close to mine. Something about the whispering, the shifting positions of the voice, the spirals. It all felt like a door I'd shut years ago being pushed back open. I leaned forward over the counter, the lantern casting long shadows that stretched across the van walls like long fingers. I wasn't imagining it. I know I wasn't. The air inside the van shifted, quietly but noticeably, a pressure change. My ears popped the way they do before a storm. And then the van rocked. Not a lot, not violently, just enough that I felt the suspension flex. My first thought was wind, always wind. But the ridge had gone still, completely still. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I waited. Something brushed against the underside of the van, a slow, dragging sound, like fingers trailing along metal. I felt my heartbeat shift into a new, unfamiliar rhythm. Not panic yet. Panic was still seconds away. This was dread, the moment when your body realizes something is wrong before your mind is willing to name it.
The dragging sound moved from the rear bumper toward the sliding door, stopping beneath the step. My lantern flickered once, twice, and then steadied. I have camped in dozens of places across this country. I have heard elk bugle in the dark. I have listened to mountain lions scream. I have woken to coyotes brushing against the van siding. But none of those sounds feel intelligent. This one did. I killed the lantern with a shaking hand. Darkness swallowed everything, except for the faint silver beam of moonlight filtering through the passenger window. Then 3 soft taps on the sliding door. Measured. Even. Just like Eli's story, just like dozens of others, I froze entirely. Even blinking felt dangerous the moment the emotional arc shifts. Quiet unease, tension, suspicion, they're all just preludes. But dread? Dread is when your instincts start screaming that something outside has learned the rhythm of your life and wants to change it. A second set of taps followed, lower this time, near the bottom of the door. Then, Colton, my name, spoken in a voice I knew, a voice I shouldn't have heard, a voice belonging to someone I had lost, someone who died before I ever bought this van. My breath stuttered. My hands trembled so violently I had to squeeze them into fists. Every viewer story I had ever heard collapsed into one truth at once. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't mimicking random strangers. It chose voices that mattered, voices that slipped beneath your defenses, voices you would open a door for. And in the sound of that voice, speaking my name, the panic finally hit. Full force, sharp, inescapable, instinct took over. I reached across the cabin, grabbed the keys, and shoved them into the ignition. But before I could turn them, something pressed against the door. Not a knock, not a drag, a hand, a full, deliberate palm. The metal bowed inward slightly, not enough to break, enough to warn, enough to say, I know you're inside, I know you're listening, I know you're alone, and you know me. I didn't turn the key. I couldn't. Something in me, something deeper than fear, knew that starting the engine at that exact moment would be the wrong move, like prey sprinting before the predator even lunges. I kept my hand frozen on the ignition, barely breathing, listening to that palm stay pressed flat against the sliding door. The metal creaked softly under the weight, a sound too subtle to be forced, too confident to be testing. It wasn't trying to break in. It was letting me know it could. I sat there in the dark, every second stretching thin enough to tear. My van felt like a coffin. Thin walls, no escape. The windows shuddered lightly, as if touched by small changes in pressure. That same emotional cold Grace described simmered at the edges of the cabin. A cold that wasn't temperature. A cold that belonged to a presence. Then the hand slid. I heard each finger drag gently across the metal, moving forward along the length of the van, tracing it, learning its shape, learning my shape. It reached the front wheel well, paused, then crawled underneath. My breath caught as something tapped directly beneath my seat. 3 deliberate knocks. My first thought wasn't terror, it was recognition. Because I'd heard those knocks before, not long ago, in a different state, in a different campground. And that memory, one I had buried deeper than I liked to admit, rose like a black tide. But I forced it down. Not now, not here. Survival first. I scanned the windows again. Moonlight skimmed the pine needles. Nothing moved. The forest held its breath like it had been waiting for this moment for years. The tapping stopped. Silence settled. Then, just as I reached slowly toward the headlight switch, something whispered through the driver's side window. A voice soft as breath across glass. Let me in, Colton. My chest tightened to the point of pain, not just because of what it said, but how it said it. This time, the voice didn't mimic the dead. It didn't borrow a memory. It used my own tone, my own cadence, as if it had learned my voice from the hundreds of videos I'd posted, studied it, practiced it. I wasn't hearing a ghost. I was hearing myself. My hand dropped away from the switch. The darkness became absolute. I felt sweat slide cold down my spine. The van creaked as if weight shifted outside, like someone was leaning into the front quarter panel or pressing their forehead against the window. Every instinct I had screamed at me to move, to flee, to turn that key and gun the engine until I reached any place with lights, people, noise, anything human.
But another instinct, quieter, older, held me still. Because if something outside wanted me to act impulsively, there had to be a reason. I waited, counted my breaths. 1, 2, 3. On the fourth breath, something brushed the window inches from my face. Not a hand, not a knock, a breath. Warm, slow, intentional. I jerked back so fast I hit the cabinet behind me. The van rocked slightly again. My heart slammed into my ribs. I couldn't see the thing, couldn't hear footsteps, but I could feel the presence, standing just outside the window, mimicking my breathing pattern exactly 1 second behind, like it was waiting for me to inhale so it could exhale in return. I didn't wait to see what came next. I twisted the key. The van roared alive. Headlights blasted across the ridge, slicing through the dark. And that was the first time I saw movement. A shape, tall, thin, impossibly pale, slipped out of the beam like smoke retreating from flame. It didn't run. It didn't stumble. It simply withdrew, melting backward into the tree line, leaving a smear of motion shaped almost like a person, but stretched too long in the wrong places. I slammed the van into drive and rolled off the leveling blocks, tires spitting gravel as I shot forward. I didn't care that the road was narrow, didn't care that one wrong turn could send me tumbling down a cliffside. Rational fear had burned away. Only survival remained. As I sped down the dirt road, branches whipped against the van's sides like hands reaching, scraping, dragging. Every shadow felt animate. The rearview mirror pulsed with darkness I refused to look at. The engine howled, laboring against the steep descent, but I didn't slow until the ridge road spit me out onto the main gravel path at the bottom. Then I saw them. Footprints. Dozens. Leading out of the woods and stopping directly in the middle of the road as if waiting for me. They were long, almost human, but not quite. Each one too narrow at the heel, too pointed at the toes, too deep for something that thin to have made. And the stride wasn't natural. Every step landed precisely the same distance apart, measured like marks from a compass. I swerved around them, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. Sweat dripped into my eyes. My breathing was ragged. But the footprints didn't end there. They turned and followed the road, like something had walked ahead of me, leading me out, guiding me down. I floored the accelerator, pushing the old Volkswagen harder than I ever had. My headlights jittered over the gravel, laying the forest whipping by on both sides like a tunnel closing in. I couldn't shake the feeling that something paced the tree line just out of sight, matching my speed, waiting for a mistake. One wrong glance, one hesitation, one moment of doubt. I would have bailed off the road and ripped my van apart if it meant getting away. But that wasn't the end. Not even close. Because halfway down the road, my radio, turned off, crackled to life. A voice hissed through the static. Not mine. Not the dead. A woman's voice I didn't recognize. "You shouldn't run, Colton." I slammed the radio power button, but the voice kept speaking, the static pulsing with each syllable like the speaker was breathing. "You can see us now." The van swerved. I barely corrected in time. My pulse hammered so hard I felt it in my jaw. "We can see you too." That was the moment panic fused with something deeper, something bone cold, something ancient. Because the way she said it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a fact. The static fizzled out. The radio died again, silent. The forest thinned. The final curve approached. Asphalt appeared ahead like salvation. My headlights caught a road sign, a crooked one pointing back toward the campsite I'd just fled. But there was something new scratched into the metal. Deep, deliberate gouges. A spiral, identical to the ones outside Grace's tent. My stomach lurched. It wasn't just mimicking voices. It wasn't just circling. It wasn't just knocking. It marked places, claimed them, spread them. I hit the pavement, tires whining. Only then did I dare glance in the mirrors. Nothing followed. The road behind me was empty. The forest swallowed itself once more, as if nothing had ever stood beneath the trees. Only then, only when silence returned, did I realize something chilling. My van smelled faintly of burnt wood, old wood, wet with rain. The same smell Eli described. The same smell that started his nightmare, the same smell that meant whatever this was, it didn't just follow him. It didn't just follow Grace. It followed stories. It followed attention. It followed me. And somehow, even as the dread sank slow and heavy into my chest, I knew this wasn't over. Because the real terror, the one none of the viewer stories prepared me for, was still waiting just a few miles down the highway. Waiting where the dark road curved into a place I thought I knew well. A place where my past waited to crawl back into the present. A place where the knocking had started years before I ever had a channel. I drove until the world thinned into desert, until the sky widened into a pale sheet of gray dawn, until the fear that sat on my skin like cold sweat began to settle into something quieter, something more dangerous. Reflection. Because fear fades, dread lingers. But reflection, that's when the truth rises. And the truth was simple. I knew exactly where I was going, not because it felt safe, but because it was the only place I'd ever run when the past caught up to me. The empty rest stop just south of Kanab, the place where my old memories lived like unsettled ghosts. I didn't plan it. My hands steered the van on instinct. My mind only caught up once the shape of the familiar concrete rest stop emerged through the fading darkness. Just a single building, one picnic table, a patch of cracked pavement that had absorbed more loneliness than any desert should be able to bear. I parked in the far corner, engine still running, headlights pointed at the empty building like a pair of watchful eyes. Nothing moved. No cars, no people. Just the slow creak of the signs swaying above the garbage bins, moving in a wind I didn't feel on my skin. For a long moment, I didn't move. Couldn't move. Because something in this place pressed against memory like a thumb against a bruise, reminding me why I hadn't been here in years. This was where I first heard the knocking, long before the viewer stories, long before the videos, long before I ever thought I'd make a life on the road. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet that followed, too heavy, too fast. The van clicked softly as it cooled, each tiny noise amplified until it felt like the metal body was exhaling after holding its breath for miles. When I finally stepped outside, the air hit me like a forgotten scent, dry, cold, heavy with dust and the faint odor of old sagebrush. The desert has its own way of watching, wide, open, unblinking. You think openness should make you feel safer. It doesn't. I walked toward the rest stop building, each footstep echoing off the concrete walkway. The bathroom lights were off, but I didn't need them to see. My mind filled the floor plan from memory. The sink with the cracked mirror, the rust stain under the paper towel dispenser, the door that never fully latched, and the stall where everything changed. The stall where I learned knocking wasn't always a request. Sometimes it was a warning or an invitation. I pushed open the bathroom door. It groaned, the same groan it had made all those years ago. The inside smelled like bleach and dust, but beneath that, faint and unlikely, was the smell of wet, burnt wood. My stomach tightened. I stepped inside anyway, because fear doesn't stop curiosity. Fear sharpens it. The first 7 feet of the room were normal, empty, silent, still. But then I saw it. The stall door, the far one, was closed, exactly as it had been that night. I walked toward it, breath catching in my throat. I raised one hand and placed my palm against the thin metal, remembering the way it felt years ago. Cool, vibrating faintly from the knocks on the other side. I whispered, barely audible, "Don't let it be the same." But the door was warm. That was worse. Much worse. Before I could move, my phone buzzed violently in my pocket, making me jump back so hard I hit the sink. I pulled it out with shaking hands. A new voice message. No name, no profile picture, no text. Just an audio clip titled, "I remember this place too." My mouth went dry. With a breath I didn't feel myself take, I pressed play. At first, only static. Then, breathing. Close, wet, too close to the microphone. Then a voice. Slow, familiar. My own voice. "Colton? You left something here." The world seemed to tilt sideways. I gripped the sink until the metal dug into my palms. Then the stall door clicked, softly, intentionally. I stumbled backward, hitting the entrance door. I didn't want to look. God, I didn't want to look. But the human brain is cruel with curiosity. My eyes slid toward the stall as the door creaked open inch by inch, revealing only a sliver of shadow, no movement, no form, just darkness. But the darkness felt wrong, too deep, too complete. Like the kind of black you see inside a cave where no light has ever been allowed to live, a shifting sound whispered from within. Not footsteps, not breathing. More like something dragging across the tile, on its hands or its elbows. I retreated another step. The stall door eased open farther, 3 inches, then 4, revealing the inside, and there, carved into the metal wall in long, shaky lines, a spiral, fresh, new, marked with something dark, something still wet. My chest squeezed so violently I thought I'd collapse. I turned, shoved through the exit, and stumbled into the cold dawn air. My legs felt numb, my breathing turned sharp. Just get to the van, just get inside, just go. I sprinted across the pavement, fumbling for the keys. My hands were trembling too hard to grip them properly. The van seemed miles away despite being only yards. I reached the sliding door and stopped dead. Because the door, the exact metal panel I had scrubbed earlier that night with a towel, now bore new streaks. 2 of them. Long. Perfectly straight. Dragged downward, exactly like the ones on my window near Flagstaff. Except these weren't faint. These were deep. Scratched. Carved. My stomach dropped to the ground. The desert wind suddenly felt like breath against my neck. I turned around slowly, expecting to see someone or something standing in the rest stop doorway. But the doorway was empty. The silence too complete, too orchestrated. I yanked the door open and climbed inside, slamming it behind me. The van rocked with my weight. My breath came in ragged bursts. I jammed the keys into the ignition and froze. Not because of something outside, because of what was inside. A small piece of folded paper sat on the driver's seat, centered perfectly. Crisp edges, clean, placed, not dropped. I didn't put it there. I didn't own any paper like that. My veins turned cold. My trembling hand reached for it, hesitating only once before unfolding it slowly, carefully, like it might bleed if I moved too fast. Inside, written in charcoal dark strokes, "You're finally listening." Then, beneath it, a symbol I'd seen in too many viewer stories to call coincidence. A spiral, not open, closed. A complete circle, meaning only one thing, not an invitation, not a warning, a claim. Before I could fully process the message, something slammed against the rear window, an impact so sudden and violent it rattled the entire van. I gasped, twisting in my seat, but the window wasn't cracked, it wasn't dented, it bore only a smear, a solid one. A handprint, 5 long fingers, pressed from the outside, held there, slowly dragging down. I didn't wait. I started the engine, flooring it so hard the van lurched, gravel spit out behind me. My tires screamed as I shot onto the highway. The desert blurred past me. My pulse hammered so loud it drowned out the engine. But as I sped down the road, a single realization took shape, a truth colder than anything I'd ever admitted aloud. This thing wasn't chasing me anymore. It was accompanying, shadowing, moving with intention, and worst of all, it had been with me much longer than I ever understood, long before viewer stories, long before I listened, long before I learned, because the truth was clawing its way out of memory now, whether I wanted it or not. This wasn't the first time I'd been claimed. Memory is a strange thing. It doesn't return like a wave. It returns like a fracture, sharp, sudden, cutting through whatever story you told yourself to survive. As the desert highway unspooled in front of me, something began to break open inside my mind. Not slowly, not gently, more like a door I'd nailed shut, finally buckling under pressure from the other side. I gripped the steering wheel tighter and breathed through the rising panic, because the memory wasn't from Utah, not from Arizona, not even from my adult life. It was from when I was 12, and it was from a place I never talk about. My childhood home, southern New Mexico. The edge of the desert where nothing grows unless it's stubborn or poisonous. The first time I heard the knocking wasn't in a bathroom stall. It was on my bedroom window. A single-story house. My room facing the empty stretch of backyard. No trees, no fence, nothing but gravel and hard-packed dirt. I jolted upright the second the memory hit me. So sudden I nearly swerved off the road. I forced the van back into my lane, heart slamming against my ribs like it wanted out. The road blurred, the horizon dimmed, the present thinned as the past pulled me under. I was 12 again, lying on a twin bed beneath a window that rattled when the wind blew across the stucco walls. The air was stale, summer heat trapped inside, sweat sticking to my back, night pressing down heavy enough to feel like a second blanket. And then, knock, knock, knock. 3 taps, measured, even. The exact pattern I'd heard in Eli's story, the same that echoed beneath my van. The same everywhere this thing followed. I remembered sitting up, confused, listening. My parents were asleep on the other side of the house. Nobody walked the yard at night. There wasn't even a walkway. I got out of bed slowly, feet touching the cool tile floor. I padded toward the window, the moonlight stretching long shadows from every toy on the carpet. The knocking came again. Knock, knock, knock. I pushed the curtain aside. Nothing. Just darkness. The outline of the shed. The faint glow of the neighbor's porch light half a block away. But then something moved, not in the yard, in the glass. A reflection that didn't belong to me, a reflection standing directly behind me, tall, thin, featureless, leaning over my shoulder. I gasped and spun around, expecting, God, I don't know what I expected, but the room was empty, totally empty. When I turned back, the reflection was gone, but a single smear streaked down the outside of the window. Just like the one on my van tonight. I blinked hard, fighting the memory away. The windshield came back into focus, the endless desert road stretching ahead. But something had shifted inside me. Some old denial dissolving, some buried truth clawing its way to the surface. This thing, it hadn't found me recently. It hadn't discovered me through the channel. It had known me since childhood. It had waited, watched, followed, and now it was done being patient. The van rattled against a rough patch of road, jerking me back to the present. My hands trembled on the wheel. I forced myself to breathe. Out, in, out. But before panic could settle into clarity, my dashboard lit up. Every warning light, every indicator, all at once, the van sputtered. Not now, I whispered. Please, not now. The engine coughed, lost power, regained it, lost it again, then died. Right there on the highway. The silence that replaced the rumbling engine was so sudden, so absolute I almost screamed just to break it, but my throat locked, because silence out here wasn't emptiness. Silence was presence. I sat frozen, hands still on the wheel despite the engine going cold. The desert around me lay motionless, a flattened world under the rising sun. But something about the stillness felt staged, like the world had paused itself for one specific moment, this one. My breath fogged the air inside the van, even though the morning was warm. Then, I heard footsteps, not on gravel, not on pavement, on the van, soft, deliberate, walking along the roof, one step, pause, second step, pause, I didn't move, didn't blink, third step, directly above my head, and then something crouched. The metal groaned downward under weight, too much weight, way too much. My pulse hammered the inside of my skull. Sweat trickled down the side of my face. I didn't dare look up, even though every instinct screamed to. Then a single word, whispered through the roof, as if spoken through the metal. Colton, not my mother's voice, not my father's, not anyone I ever knew. Just a shape of my name made from breath and hunger. My heart stopped, then restarted too fast. The weight shifted, scraped forward, moved toward the windshield. I finally looked up. A shadow passed over the sun visor, long, distorted, bending in angles no body should bend. Then I heard tapping on the windshield. Not 3 taps this time. 5. Like fingers, tapping in a slow, curious rhythm. Tap, 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 tap. I tried to turn the key again. The engine churned but wouldn't catch. The tapping grew faster, more eager, more insistent. I slammed my hand onto the ignition, twisting it until my wrist hurt. The van sputtered, lurched, and finally roared back to life. The moment the engine caught, the weight on the roof shifted violently. Something slid down the windshield in a streak of pale blur. I didn't see its face, didn't want to, but I saw movement, too smooth, too strange, like something crawling upside down, the way insects cling to glass. I floored the accelerator. The van jolted forward, tires spinning on the pavement before catching in a violent burst. The shape peeled away from the windshield, slithering off the front bumper. The moment it detached, I saw something fly up into the air. A scrap of paper. It stuck to the glass for a split second before being whipped away by the wind. I didn't need to read it. I knew exactly what it said. What it always said. Let me in. The road blurred beneath me as I hit 80, pushing the old engine far beyond its comfort zone. My eyes stung. My hands ached from gripping the wheel. But even as distance grew between me and whatever moved across my roof, a sickening realization spread through my chest. This wasn't triggered by a place, or a story, or a mistake. This thing had been following me for years. It had circled me as a child, knocked on windows, mimicked reflections, shadowed my campsites, learned my voice. And now it wanted me to understand something. Viewer stories weren't coincidences. They were warnings, breadcrumbs, pieces of a puzzle pointing to one truth. We weren't dealing with isolated encounters. We were dealing with a pattern. Something old, something wandering, something patient. Something that traveled from person to person through attention, through fear, through story. And for the first time, as the highway stretched endlessly ahead, I realized the thing wasn't hunting me. It was drawing me somewhere, to someone, to something I wasn't ready to face again, something I'd buried just as deeply as I'd buried the memory of that night in New Mexico. Because the truth waiting ahead, the truth this thing wanted me to return to, was tied to the one story I'd never shared on my channel, the story of the person who first heard the knocking with me, the one who didn't survive it. I kept driving until the desert gave way to mesas, until the mesas gave way to the scrubby foothills that marked the edge of New Mexico. I hadn't meant to cross the state line. I hadn't planned a destination. But my hands, my instincts, knew where I needed to go. And the van followed without protest, as if the road beneath it had been pre-written. The thing that climbed my windshield, the voice that mimicked my own, the spiral carved into metal, none of it was random. It was dragging me back to the beginning. Back to the one place I promised I'd never return, the house where my cousin Diego disappeared. We were the same age, 12 that summer, same height, same reckless courage, same endless curiosity, and the same night terrors. But he was the first to admit something strange followed him. He was the first to tell me he heard knocking on the walls long before I ever did. He was the first to say he heard voices repeating his name from places no voice should reach. He was also the first to vanish. And I never told anyone the whole truth, not the police, not my parents, not myself, because the truth sounded impossible. But impossible things don't leave handprints on your van. Impossible things don't whisper in your voice. Impossible things don't carve spirals on rest stop walls. Only one thing does. I turned off the highway, my tires bouncing onto the old dirt road that led to my childhood home. The sky hung low, heavy with dust. The landscape stood like a graveyard of sagebrush and rusted fencing. Every mile I drove tightened something inside my chest. Finally, the house appeared. Small, single story, abandoned for a decade, its windows boarded, its roof sagging, weeds breaking through the foundation, but the front door was open, just slightly, just enough to look deliberate. The air around the house felt wrong. It didn't feel empty. It felt occupied, filled, like the silence itself had weight, like something inside was holding its breath, waiting for the right moment to inhale. I parked a good distance away and stepped out, boots crunching on broken gravel. The air smelled of burnt wood and dust, too familiar now to ignore. The closer I got to the house, the thicker that scent grew. My heartbeat throbbed in my ears. Quiet unease slipped back into me. Not fear, recognition. As I approached the porch, I noticed something carved into the doorframe. A spiral. But this one wasn't open-ended. It had been carved deep, closed fully, etched with a finality that made my stomach twist. A claim. On the house. On the memories. On me. I pushed the door open. It groaned. Same sound as years ago, same smell of dust and old carpet, same cold draft sliding through the hallway. The living room still held the collapsed sofa frame and the old water stains on the wall. My mother used to complain about those stains, said they looked like reaching fingers. I always thought she was joking. Now, I wasn't so sure. I walked toward the bedroom hallway.
My fingers brushed the walls as I passed, those familiar bumps in the paint, the cracks spidering out from the corners. Every step forward pulled another memory to the surface, each one cutting deeper than the last. When I reached my old bedroom door, I stopped. It was closed. It was never closed. My throat tightened, my hand hovered over the knob, the air grew still like the house was listening. I opened the door slowly. The room was almost empty. Just a stripped mattress resting crooked on the floor, a broken nightstand, dust thick enough to write in. And on the window, the same window where I'd seen that impossible reflection all those years ago, 5 streak marks dragged down on the outside of the glass, fresh, as if made hours ago. I stepped inside, heart in my throat. The sunlight hit the floor in a thin, dusty beam, and that's when something shifted behind me. Not footsteps, not breathing, weight on the house. Roof beams creaked, walls tightened, as if something massive crashed lightly into the structure, like settling its weight on top of it like a predator lying across a burrow. The smell of burnt wood filled the room. I backed toward the center, instinct screaming at me to leave, but instinct was too late. In the silence, a voice slid through the air like a blade through fabric. Colton. My name. Not whispered through metal, not distorted by distance, spoken from the hallway, in Diego's voice, my cousin's voice, the one who disappeared. My stomach dropped. My breath vanished. My vision tunneled. But the voice continued. You came back. I turned slowly toward the hallway. The figure standing there wasn't human, but it wore the shape of one. A tall silhouette, stretched just enough to be wrong, like a shadow cast by something deeper than a wall could ever hold. Its limbs were too long, its shoulders too narrow, its head tilted slightly, unnaturally. But the face wasn't a face at all, just a flat surface where features should be. A surface that shifted, rippled, blurred, until it took on the faintest outline of a boy, a familiar boy, Diego. My chest collapsed inward, my legs nearly buckled. The creature took one slow step into the room, the floor creaked, the walls pressed inward, responding to its presence, and the voice, Diego's voice, came again. I waited for you, my throat burned. You're not him. The face shifted. Muscles, or something like muscles, twitched across its surface. We started together. My voice cracked. It took another step. You opened the door first. My blood froze, because that was the truth I had buried deeper than anything else. That night, when I saw the reflection behind me, I had run to Diego's room. I had woken him. I had told him I heard knocking. He had believed me, and we both went outside. We opened the back door together, but Diego was the one who stepped out first. The one who heard his name whispered. The one who walked into the dark. The one who vanished behind the shed. I had run. I had hidden. I had survived. And something had attached itself to me, fed on the fear, followed me, claimed me. 12 years old, and I didn't understand that survival sometimes looks exactly like guilt. The creature, whatever it truly was, stepped fully into the room now. Its long fingers brushed the cracked paint of the doorframe, its head tilted. You left me here. I was a kid, I whispered. You still are. The walls strained. The smell of burnt wood thickened. The windows shook. The creature extended a hand, long, pale, almost gentle. Let me in. Not a threat. A request. A promise. My breathing turned frantic. I stepped back until my knees hit the mattress. My voice barely worked. What do you want? The face shifted again, losing Diego's outline, becoming something blank, something ancient. I want you to remember. And then, I want you to finish what you started. The spiral on the doorframe pulsed in the corner of my vision. The floor vibrated. The air thinned. This was the moment everything had been building toward. The knocking, the spirals, the voices, the chasing. Not to kill me, but to bring me back. And now the creature had finally cornered me in the place where everything began, where everything had been left unfinished, where one final choice waited, a choice I hadn't had the courage to make then, a choice the creature demanded now. The creature's hand hovered inches from me, fingers long enough to curl around my entire forearm if it wanted. The air inside that bedroom constricted like a throat mid-swallow. Dust floated in thin streams through the sunlight beam, carrying memories I didn't want and truths I wasn't ready for. Its voice, Diego's voice, came again, but thinner this time. Not pleading, not threatening, expectant. You owe me. My chest ached. Not with fear. Fear had already burned itself to ash inside my ribs. What remained was something heavier, something I'd been running from since I was 12 years old. Guilt. I closed my eyes, and the memory finally snapped into clarity. Diego stepping outside, the soft crunch of gravel, me whispering, "Come back," him turning, him smiling, him saying he wasn't scared, the darkness swallowing him whole between one blink and the next. A heavy tear rolled down my cheek. I opened my eyes. "No," I whispered, not to the memory, but to the creature. "I don't owe you." The creature's head twitched, not sharply, slowly, like a puppet learning a new range of movement it didn't understand. Its voice sharpened, not Diego's voice, not mine, but something like both woven together. "You left him. I was a child. You ran. I survived. You forgot. I tried to." Its hand extended fully now, palm open, impossibly pale and impossibly long, the edges of the fingers blurred slightly as though the flesh wasn't entirely solid. "Let me in." This time, the words weren't mimicked. They were original. Ancient. The tone carried weight and hunger and something like longing. The spiral carved into the doorframe began to pulse faintly, each throb syncing with my racing heartbeat, as if my veins in the mark were connected by something invisible. My knees nearly buckled, but in that trembling something shifted inside me. Not panic, not surrender. Resolve. Because all these years, the wrong truth, I believed I was running from something that wanted vengeance. Something that wanted to finish what began in this house. Something that marked me as prey. But standing here, facing this thing fully, I realized something else. It wasn't hunting me. It wasn't tormenting me. It was trying to fill a void I left behind. Not out of cruelty, out of imitation, out of instinct. Creatures like this, whatever they truly are, they don't understand human grief. They don't understand abandonment. They don't know the difference between a door opening for help and a door opening for harm. They only understand connection, attachment, attention. Diego had stepped out first, and it had followed him. And when he vanished, it followed the next closest heartbeat, mine. All these years, it wasn't trying to destroy me. It was trying to replace him. The realization landed in me like a burning stone. My breathing steadied. The floor stopped vibrating beneath my feet. I lifted my chin, meeting the creature's shifting, unfinished face. "I can't let you in," I said, "but I can face you." The creature froze. This was new. This was not part of the pattern. This was not how prey behaved. Its hand withdrew slightly, as if uncertain. I took a step forward. "You're not him." The face wavered. Diego's features dissolved like fog. Something older began to show beneath. No eyes, no mouth, just movement. "You're not my guilt." The spiral in the doorway dimmed. "You're not my fear." The air pressure in the room loosened, as if the walls exhaled. "You are not my unfinished story." Something inside the creature shuddered, and then, for the first time, it retreated. A single step backward, a twitch of its tilted head, a folding of its two long limbs. Not in anger, not in rage, in understanding, or perhaps in disappointment. Because creatures like this don't chase people who walk toward their fear. They chase people who run from it. I took another step forward, the mattress shifting beneath me. The creature retreated again. 2 steps now. Its form flickered as if losing shape, losing definition, losing purpose. "Go," I said softly, not a shout, not a command, a release. The creature paused at the threshold. The temperature dropped, then rose, like a wave of shadow passing through the doorway. The final whisper that left its dissolving shape wasn't Diego's, wasn't mine, wasn't human. It was something I felt more than heard. "You remember." And with that, it folded backward into the hallway, like a sheet collapsing in on itself. The shadows swallowed its form. The air stilled. The smell of burnt wood vanished. I stood alone, not safe, not untouched, but unclaimed. For the first time since childhood, I stepped out of the bedroom slowly, my legs weak, my hands trembling with the aftermath of a fear stretched too far for too long. The hallway looked the same, empty, dusty, but it felt lighter, as though the house had been holding its breath for 13 years,
and finally let it out. When I reached the front door, I paused and looked back one last time. The spiral on the doorframe, the one that had pulsed with my heartbeat, was fading, losing definition, losing darkness, shrinking into nothing. That's when the final truth hit me. It never needed my fear. It needed my attention. And now that I faced it, truly faced it, I wasn't giving it anymore. I walked back toward the van. The sky had warmed to a pale blue. The cold morning wind slipped under my shirt, grounding me. When I opened the sliding door, I expected handprints, scratches, another message. There was nothing, just my backpack, my stove, my blankets, the life I chose, the life I could keep choosing. I sat inside and let my breath settle. Somewhere beyond the desert horizon, I knew the creature would drift, untethered now, searching for another spiral, another unhealed memory, another unfinished story to feed on. But not mine. Not anymore. As I pulled onto the road, letting the old Volkswagen rumble beneath me, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not relief, not triumph. Closure. And sitting there behind the wheel, miles of road ahead, I realized something even bigger. Something meant for the viewers who sent me their stories. The ones who whispered their fears into voice memos, the ones who thought they were alone in what followed them. The things chasing us aren't always monsters. Sometimes they're memories, sometimes they're guilt, sometimes they're shadows shaped by loneliness and loss. And the scariest ones, they're the ones we refuse to look at. Because fear doesn't grow in the dark. It grows in avoidance. I drove toward the rising sun, the desert widening around me in a silent, endless embrace. And somewhere behind me, in an abandoned house settling back into quiet decay, a spiral finally erased itself. Not because a monster was defeated, but because a memory was faced. And as the van climbed onto the open highway, I let the words settle in my chest. Words meant for anyone who's ever run from their own unfinished story. You don't escape fear by outrunning it. You escape fear by naming it, facing it, walking straight into the place it first learned your name. Only then does it finally let go. Only then do you finally get to leave.